Hello and welcome. I am Chilling Tales. And as you get ready for bed, you must know that you are doing amazing and you deserve all the sleep you can get. So as you are winding down, let me know where you are from and what time you are watching this video. Like and subscribe to help the channel if you'd like. Now put your mind at ease and let the story unfold. The sea makes a sound at night that isn't like the sea in the day. In sunlight, it's a public thing, pages turning loudly, applause from stones, gulls heckling the waves as they fall short of their own height. After dark, it forgets the audience. It becomes the inside voice of water, patient and rhythmic, a breathing larger than any body that ever learned to rest. I listened to that voice from the ferry's stern, while the mainland shrank to a Boolean answer. Yes, there was land, then no, there wasn't, and the lighthouse rose out of the fog like a habit the ocean couldn't break. The tower was older than anything that had ever told me the time. It stood on a black knuckle of rock that had punched up through tide and remained stubborn ever since. The white paint had taken more winters than I had birthdays. Above it, the lantern room glass cupped the last of the day, like a hand reluctant to let the light go. I had said yes to the job in a week, when saying yes seemed a way to keep sentences from ending too abruptly. Night caretaker, off-season, 1-month trial, lodging provided, stipend modest, meals by arrangement with the keeper's house if you can be polite about it. The email had used words like reliable and sober and capable of solitude. I answered with a list of tools I could use and a photograph that didn't show how restlessness looks in a person's shoulders. The head keeper, a woman named Orr, shook my hand on the dock with the dry grip of those who have decided not to apologize for the weather anymore. "You came before dark," she said. "That shows promise." The assistant, a man my age with hair that seemed to belong to a less windy county, carried my duffel without making me argue. "Evan," he said, and I nodded like I had been expecting that name. We climbed the path that thinks it's a staircase, gulls making their thin complaints, the lighthouse closer and farther with each switchback. At the base, the door had a dent the shape of a shoulder. The hinge knew how to be faithful without being loud. Inside was cool and smelled of iron and the long, clean dust of lenses. The spiral stair rose like a vertebrae, worn in the middle where feet had corrected stone. "We keep simple rules," Orr said, walking ahead with the measured stride you use for ladders and arguments. "Log the arc on the hour. Wipe the glass as if a ship is counting on you, because it is. Keep the lens from collecting the wrong fingerprints. Never leave the lamp alone when she's working. If the fog comes up fast, wake the horn. Too long, one short. Then wind again, even if you think it's had enough of you. Don't listen to the radio after 2. It listens back. If you hear the bell when there's no swell, sit down." She said it like a recipe she'd been handed on paper that had dissolved into memory. "Any questions?" "What's the wrong fingerprint?" I asked. "You'll know it," she said, not unkindly. We reached the lantern room, and the air changed. The glass held light even before Orr turned anything on. It was as if the panes remembered how to be transparent with more enthusiasm than necessary. The lens took up most of the room, polished prisms stacked like disciplined rainbows, their edges catching my heartbeat and returning it in pieces. "Second-order Fresnel," Evan said, as if introducing me to an intimidating aunt. She told ships off this shoulder when steam was a novelty, and men thought distance could be bargained with. A small brass plaque on the pedestal said the light's name, which I won't write here because certain names enjoy attention too much. Or showed me the clockwork weight, the regulator, the lamp, the switch I wasn't supposed to need, but would be grateful for when I did. She put my hand on the handrail that keeps you from forgetting the floor is patient, but not indulgent. "This tower doesn't much like hurry," she said. "Walk as if the steps are teaching you how to be heavy in the right places." We descended to the service level where the log lay open on a sloped desk. The pages had lines faded paler than the sea in February. The previous entries were in a tidy hand that did not apologize for weather either. Visibility 3 miles, light constant, horn as required. A notation in the margin, not in the same tidy hand. If the beam lingers south, don't coax it. The south wants what it wants. I touched the edge of the paper and felt a faint tack, like salt or sugar dried there last season, or handed me a ring of keys and a short pencil sharpened as if by a knife that preferred useful work to conversation. We make our own food unless the mainland remembers us, she said. Kettle works, stove sulks, bread is for mornings, not now. Mug hooks are right of the sink, left are for visitors. There are visitors, there are birds, Evan said, and the station cat, who uses hooks as moral instruction. After they left me, the lighthouse took my measure with the slow thoroughness of rooms that have learned to be suspicious of new lungs. I unpacked in the keeper's room below the lantern deck, where a narrow bed understood those who remember ships when they sleep. The window's thick glass made the horizon seem closer and farther, the way memory does when it chooses. My duffel became the appropriate amount of furniture for a person who had decided to be temporary. On the sill lay a folded note in Orr's hand. If the tower knocks after midnight, count to 12. Open on 12. If it knocks again before 4, don't. Try not to need to know why. The first watch was not yet mine. Orr ran the lamp up into its measured blaze, while the last of the mainland slipped from gray into suggestion. Evan showed me the pantry, with its jars labeled not with contents, but with the names of storms they survived. I ate stew that had preserved the idea of beef, better than the beef itself, and bread that tasted like internal weather. We sat in the watchroom for a while, with our chairs tilted back 2 inches from caution, and spoke of useless things on purpose. The way fog learns your name if you live with it. The rumor that the old bell had sunk and still rang some nights from floor to ceiling of the sea. The pattern gulls make when they've found something a mile off and haven't decided whether to announce it. It isn't haunted, Evan said suddenly, not looking at me. That's not what this is. What is it? He considered the lamp as if it had made a joke. It keeps its own company, and sometimes the horizon answers. Or sent him down to sleep and gave me the hour alone. I walked the circle of glass, cloth in one hand, habit already in the other. The lens made a low sound, no machine whine, more like breath through a throat that didn't need it, a faint hymn of friction and gratitude. When the beam reached south, it lengthened, infinitesimal, as if the light had been given extra seconds to articulate a thought. I checked the regulator, checked the rotation, found nothing wrong, and everything slightly opinionated. I wiped the panes until stars resembled their known selves. The radio muttered from the shelf by the log. I turned the dial gently, the way you wake a friend in the middle of a story. Static rearranged itself into a human idea, and then lost interest. I left it at a low murmur in a language that seemed to be fog. On the hour, I recorded the arc and the weather and the number of birds obliged to argue with the lantern. The wind grew disciplined, the lamp maintained, the horn slept, the sea wrote lines without punctuation below. At 11 the tower knocked. It was unmistakable, not pipe, not gear, not wind rehearsing, a knock on stone from the outside, polite and patient. I set the pencil in the groove at the log's edge and counted, because counting is the rope people throw down wells, hoping the well will learn to climb. 1 to 12. The 12th was an opening, the way numbers sometimes are. I climbed to the door that leads to the narrow walk around the lantern room. The latch was older than my desire to use it. I turned it and stepped out into air stitched with salt. The night had polished itself. Stars stood where they're meant to. The beam went about its articulate business. On the gallery's rail lay a smear like wet fingers. Not recent, not old. something in between that makes your heart decide to pretend. I leaned to look down. The rock fell away into foam that accepted it without ceremony. Nothing in the water but the larger breathing. I waited until waiting turned into a second name for standing. When I went back in, the lamp's tone had shifted lower by a shade of thought, as if it had been given permission to confide. The radio cleared its throat. A voice came in as if from between teeth. "Come about," said the voice, in a tone that did not invite argument. I touched the knob as if to apologize without changing anything. The hour passed. The light did what light does when it has decided to be professional. At midnight, the fog came as if someone had rolled it down a hallway. One moment, the stars were teaching the black water how to be black. The next, there was only white, dense enough to be a surface. I woke the horn, two long, one short, and felt in the bones of the tower the way it appreciated being reminded of itself. The sound sank and rose and came back forgiving. In the horn's pause, I heard another bell answer from somewhere west, where there is nothing but water. Not the pitch of any vessel I had learned, not the old iron sunk below us. A small bell, patient and exact. It rang 3 times, with spaces you could sit in if you were the kind of sound that liked to rest. The radio whispered again. "Come about," it said, and then, with a courtesy that chilled me more than any weather, "Please." I wrote it in the log and underlined it without knowing why, and the pencil lead broke in the act, as if it had been designed to do that when certain words appeared. The next hour was weather, and then more weather, and the lamp's emphasis on the south grew, until I stopped pretending I wasn't noticing. I knelt by the pedestal and inspected everything not worth inspecting. I walked the circle and heard the lens murmur in a voice that made a person want to smooth its hair. When I looked south, the fog parted in a seam that admitted a darker dark. A silhouette stood there on the flat water, where silhouettes don't stand. Not a ship, not a rock, a narrow, upright thing, as if someone had placed a door on the horizon and told it to consider itself sea. I blinked and the seam closed. The knock came again, farther down the tower now, around the level where the last service landing lets you look into the lighthouse's throat and decide whether you trust it. I counted, and on 12 I didn't open, because Orr had written that opening twice is a kind of invitation, and I was not yet hospitable to the idea of being hospitable. The knock stopped without resentment. The foghorn blew its schedule, and the answering bell was closer, as if a small boat had ceased to be small. I remembered suddenly the one wrong fingerprint, and felt the hair along my arms translate what I had been touching all evening. On the north pane, low, tucked where a lazy cloth might ignore it, was the oval of a hand too long in the fingers and too even in the pressure, as if it had been pressed with the care of a person who has 3 times practiced not to smudge. I breathed on the glass, and the print brightened with satisfaction. I wiped it, and it came back a shade farther to the right, as if it were learning my habits by inches. After 2, I left the radio to talk to itself, because Orr had asked me to pretend not to be curious. The tower didn't knock again. The sea spoke to itself. The lamp made choices I could not prove were choices. When Orr climbed the stair just before Gray made islands out of the world again, she looked at my entry in the log, and at my face, and at the place where the wrong fingerprint had decided for now to be absent. "First nights usually take less," she said mildly, as if praising a weather system. "You heard it then?" "Something," I said. "Come about," she said, trying the words in her mouth, as if to check for fit. "They say that when they want you to turn." "Who's they?" She folded the cloth I had left wrongly on the rail and set it down properly, as if answering were as much a matter of alignment as of vocabulary. "Out there it's nobody," she said. "Up here it's anybody who needs you too. Down here," she tapped the log, "it's us, and we write it politely so the keeper after you will know the tone to expect." Evan arrived with the moral weight of coffee. He eyed the horizon and yawned like a man whose body knows what work is for. Sleep, Orr said, not an order, a diagnosis. I went down past the landing where the knock had waited and laid my hand against the stone. It was warmer than you'd think. In the keeper's room, I lay on the narrow bed and watched the window until the fog decided to be lesson instead of weather. When I finally slept, I dreamed the lens turned without the lamp, and the beam was not light, but a column of I'm here, sweeping the world. Something in that world considered the message and moved toward it with the grace of tide. When I woke, the dream remained, like the taste of iron after biting your lip, and the log on the desk had a new entry written in the tidy hand that was not mine, and not Orr's, and not Evan's, and in the margin, as if annotated by a teacher grading the ocean, someone had written, "You turned. Daylight at the lighthouse is less honest than you'd think. It isn't the gold postcard glow that makes painters pack easels, nor the clean wide light that sailors describe in memoirs. It's more like a reluctant bargain. The sun agrees to shine, the sea agrees to reflect, but the rock under the tower declines to acknowledge either. Shadows here are too sharp, falling across the stairs like drawn blades. Even breakfast tasted like decisions, the bread dense, the butter faintly salted as if it remembered fingers that had worked nets. Evan sat with his chair tipped, staring at the radio that now whispered nothing but static. It was clear last night, he said finally, like a man reporting a weather pattern he'd rather forget. I said nothing. My log entry from the night waited between us like an unopened letter, or didn't read it aloud, just skimmed, then closed the book with the finality of a ship's hatch. The wrong fingerprint, she said, almost to herself, already. The hours passed as labor does, scraping rust from the iron rail, cataloging the pantry jars, oiling the hinges that protest for the sake of habit. Evan showed me the cat, a lean, brindled creature that moved as if water had been taught to wear fur. It tolerated my hand briefly before disappearing into stone, as though cracks were doorways. She'll come back when she wants, Evan said, like the fog. He had a way of phrasing things that suggested fog and cats belonged to the same order of being. By mid-afternoon, a storm drew itself up without hurry. Clouds muscled the horizon into gray, and the wind leaned on the lantern room glass, as if testing it for loyalty. Orr ordered shutters, fastened on the keeper's quarters, and the auxiliary lamp checked. This is only rehearsal, she said, but rehearsal is where you learn whether you can stand the script. By dusk the rain had arrived, not in sheets but in long slanted knives. The tower shuddered with each gust. Evan wound the horn, which bellowed like some creature refusing exile. The radio spat and cleared its throat. For a moment, between bursts of static, a voice again. Come about. This time it was lower, drawn out, a syllable stretched until it frayed. Orr set her mug down hard enough that the liquid climbed the sides. Ignore it, she said. We always ignore it. Her eyes, though, betrayed the effort of remembering how. At 9, the knock returned. This time it wasn't polite. It came from the mid-level gallery, 3 sharp blows that traveled through the spiral stair, like a hammer down bone. I froze, cloth still in my hand from wiping condensation. Evan shook his head violently, mouthing "don't," or counted under her breath, lips barely moving. At 12, the knocking stopped, but the silence after was worse, like a held breath waiting for permission to exhale. The lamp's beam faltered for half a rotation, dragging south again, longer than it should. The wrong fingerprint bloomed on the pane, 2 this time, parallel, as though someone had pressed both hands flat to glass. I wiped them, and the cloth came away damp with something darker than condensation. It smelled faintly of salt, faintly of rust, faintly of blood. Don't touch it, Bear, or snapped. Too late. The edge of my finger had brushed the smear. It tingled, not painful, not numb, but alive in a way skin shouldn't be. I tucked my hand behind me like a schoolboy. "What happens if you do?" I asked. She didn't answer. The log absorbed the moment instead, my pencil scratching. 912 South lingered. Double prints. Contact made. The pencil broke again, clean as bone. By midnight, the storm had deepened into theater. Waves hurled themselves against the rock with a sound like boulders confessing. The lamp kept turning, but the beam seemed thinner, stretched as though diluted by unseen hands. I heard the bell again, 3 notes from nowhere, patient as before. Evan muttered a prayer without saints. I sat with the log open, staring at the margin where yesterday's handwriting had appeared. Nothing yet. I told myself not to look away. That vigilance was a kind of shield. But around 1, my eyes blurred, and when I blinked, a line had joined the page. "You heard us." Beneath it, in smaller script, as though written with a child's stub of chalk, "We see you." I shut the book harder than necessary. The sound carried through the tower. A minute later, the knock returned. Soft, coaxing, at the very base as though someone stood ankle-deep in surf and tapped politely with a knuckle. I counted to 12. On 12, the air in the lantern room shifted temperature. Warmer, moist. I swear I smelled kelp, wet wood, and the faint copper note of opened veins. The lamp flared, bright enough to sting, and then steadied. I wanted to run down the stairs, slam the door, wedge furniture against it, but Orr's earlier words chained me. Never leave the lamp alone when she's working, so I stayed. The storm withdrew toward dawn, dragging its knives behind it. The sky bled gray into gray until horizon returned like a rumor. Evan collapsed in his chair, face in his hands. Orr remained upright, spine stiff as though she'd been nailed into her posture. When I left the lantern room to fetch water, I found the stair damp. Not rain. There are no leaks in that stone. Seaweed clung to one step, green, black, and fresh. My stomach turned cold. I carried it outside, flung it back into surf, and swore not to mention it. But silence is not the same as safety. Sleep came late, and badly. I dreamed of standing outside the tower, looking up at my own window. My face stared back, but the expression wasn't mine. The mouth moved, silently at first, then with words I felt in my chest. Turn, turn, turn. I woke with my pillow damp, not with sweat, not with seawater, but with something that smelled faintly metallic. The next evening, Orr spoke quietly over bread and coffee. Some lights were built only to warn ships. Others were built to keep things away. This one, she let the sentence hang, unfinished, a rope without a knot. "Why me?" I asked before I could stop myself. Evan looked up sharply. Orr met my gaze, her eyes steady as the lamp itself. "Because you answered the ad," she said, "and because you don't yet know what you'll do when it knocks the 3rd time." The 3rd day wore its weather like a disguise. Morning passed as if nothing had happened. Blue worked into the water with a laundress's patience, wind on good behavior, gulls extravagant with opinions that belonged to yesterday. Orr made porridge that tasted like a sensible argument and insisted we eat it without dramatics. Evan fixed a hinge that didn't need fixing. I scrubbed salt from the catwalk rail until the rag showed clean and my knuckles had learned the numbers the railing preferred. Inside the lantern room, the lens stood in perfect glass posture, the beam sleeping inside it, the way a knife sleeps in a sheath. The log lay open to a blank line that seemed wider than other blanks. That was the day's first lie. By noon, a freckling of cloud organized itself into a hazy lid. The sea flattened the way seas do when they decide to have secrets. Or checked the clockwork twice, then a 3rd time, though we hadn't run on weight since before I arrived. The motor hummed with the quiet of a machine that has learned to pretend it's not alive. "We'll run the lamp early," she said. "Light in an honest sky offends nobody." I climbed. unrolled the cloth, and circled the glass with the practiced reverence of a new acolyte. Halfway round, I found a place the cloth didn't want to pass. No smear, no grit, a thickness in air. I pushed, and the cloth slid as if over skin, not glass. When I lifted it, a faint oval lingered, invisible from a step away, undeniable if you knew to look. The wrong fingerprint had returned with better manners. I didn't tell I didn't tell myself, not properly. I polished it away and let the beam go to work, white and clean, its first slow breath like the beginning of a hymn. Evan tuned the radio to silence on purpose and gave it a glance as you glance at a sleeping child who has been ill. The cat appeared, leapt into the watch chair that gives the best view south, and curled into an exact furred comma. Dusk came as a decision rather than a gradient. The lamp's sweep put its shoulder to distance. The horn was idle. The horizon drew a black line under a purple question. At 8, the radio lifted its head. Not static, not a station, not the cordial murder of thunderstorms. The same voice as before, the one like a tide, speaking through a teeth of rock. Come about, drawn out, patient, almost tender. Evan's hand twitched toward the dial and found it already where it belonged. We heard you, he said under his breath, as if answering a child at the door. No. At 9, rain stitched itself into the air without ever falling. The glass bloomed with moisture that was not condensation. The wrong oval brightened again. So did another, mirroring it. The two of them a pair too high to be the hands of a person on a ladder, and too symmetrical to be accident. I wiped them. The cloth returned wet with something clear that went darker at the edges. The smell was kelp and rust, and something like a coin held too long in a mouth. I wrote it down, and the pencil did not break. That felt like permission I didn't want. We kept the hour. The beam did its arc like a sentence that knows where it wants to end. The south took its little extra. At 10, the tower knocked for the 3rd time. You know the way a knock can make the house decide what kind of house it is. Some knocks turn dwellings into fortresses. Others turn them into instruments. This one made the lighthouse into a bell. The sound came from low, where stone meets stone and admits there is something beneath that isn't bedrock, only patience. It traveled up the spiral and found the chamber under the lens and made it hum. I stood without meaning to, or closed her eyes like a person bracing for the orchestral hit that follows the soft passage. Evan whispered the numbers with me. 1, 2, 3, and it felt like counting vertebrae. At 12, I moved toward the hatch that leads to the outside walk, because that's what the rule said, and because rules are a way to give your hands something to do when your head is considering running. Wait, Orr said, and did not sound like someone who tells people to wait often. Not that door. She nodded toward the stair. Down. There is a kind of obedience that has nothing of agreement in it, only the memory of not dying when you did what you were told. I followed her, Evan behind me. At the service landing, she pressed her palm against the cold, damp stone and listened. The knock came once more, soft, like the bruise after the blow. She lifted the latch on a small door I hadn't noticed. Its boards painted the same careful white as the tower. It opened onto a set of steps half the width of the main stair, the difference between a road and a throat. The air from below smelled old and wet and not entirely seawater. We keep simple rules, Orr had said when I arrived. She had not mentioned this door. Only once, she said now. Only when it insists, and only if we bring it back up after. I went first because my body had already decided to. My lantern made a small yellow fact in that narrow dark. The steps slicked under my boots with a slime that hadn't learned manners. The stone sweated. The sound of the sea came through the wall, on the right, as pressure more than sound, as if the ocean had its ear pressed there, Eavesdropping. At the bottom was another door, not painted, just boards held to their employment by bolts that had seen more arguments than I ever will, or set her keys in the lock and turned without looking at them, the way you do at a gate you have unlocked 200 times in weather that wants you to think you can't. The room beyond was round like the tower and narrow like a well. The floor wasn't quite floor. It was a grating of iron that looked like language. Through its squares, a black water glistened. That wasn't the sea. Not directly the tide seeped here, not surged. The air was warmer than the stair and carried a sweet, exhausted stench. Kelp left in a basket too long, rope that had been in a mouth, wet wool on a radiator, rust rubbed with a thumb forever. On the wall opposite the door hung a bell, not the fog bell, smaller, older, its iron mouth salted white. A rope trailed from its tongue, frayed to a tassel by generations of the same argument. The knock came again, and this time it wasn't on stone. It was on the underside of the grating, directly beneath where I stood. A single tap, polite to the point of insult. I moved before I thought, and the lantern swung and made our shadows into a lesson. Between two squares of iron, something pale pressed upward. Not a hand. Hands have the decency of joints. This was longer, the suggestion of knuckles spaced too far apart, the tip more blunt than fingers should be, the whole of it patient as cold. It pushed very slightly against the grate and stopped. It didn't test, it waited. Above us, faintly, the lamp hummed its enormous punctuation into the night. "What is it?" I asked, and the question was the childish kind, uselessly shaped, frightened of any answer that wouldn't let me keep this mouth with its current number of teeth. "The answer?" Orr said. "To the light." Evan stood with his back to the door like a man swearing to be a stopper if he had to. "Don't lean," he said. "Not to me, to the iron." The pale knot hand withdrew a fraction. The water took a breath. A voice rose from it, as sound rises from a shell if you hold it to your ear and believe. Not words, exactly, but the shape of them, the cadence, the etiquette. It was the same voice we had heard in the radio, only nearer, less filtered by metal and miles. "Come about," it said, not a command, an invitation. Then softer, nearer, "We see you." I was not the kind of person who kneels in front of wells. I knelt, the lantern light found the surface. Not quite a reflection, not quite a face. I saw light, and within it the moving suggestion of a gaze that knew about watch rotations and weather and the way a person stands when they promise to stay at their post. It was not a ship, it was not a body that had ever kept air under its ribs. It was wakefulness, organized and old, shaped by the persistence of a lamp that had swept a century of horizon, saying, "I'm here to the dark," until the dark learned the phrase and decided to practice it back. "What do you want?" I asked, and I could hear how small the question was in that round room, how many keepers and assistants and lighthouse cats had sat where I did and asked their version, and how the answer always made the askers become either better or less themselves. The water convulsed fondly, like a cat on a lap. "Come about," it said again, and offered something like a picture, a sense of the beam turning just a touch more south, of the arc lengthened a hair, of two ships between reefs being allowed to believe themselves chosen. And behind that picture, a kindness that felt like teeth polished to civility. "We see you," it said again, and this time I understood a little more. It meant the tower, and the lamp, and the ones who kept it. It meant the way a particular heartbeat learns the cadence of watch hours. It meant that if we turned just so, if we allowed the beam to stretch as it wanted to, when the fog was listening, something would come to be counted, and we could write visibility reduced, and horn as required, and survived in the log with honest hands. Orr's voice came from behind me, low enough to keep from being reflected by iron. It wants a say. We don't give it one, she said. Not more than a degree. Not more than a breath. She stepped closer. Her boots made the grating speak the language of weight. When they built this tower, they thought the rock was for ships. The rock holds the lamp up for the water. Don't forget the direction of service. What happens if the lamp? I couldn't say obeys. I couldn't say turns. The word in my mouth was softer than both. Like leans. We call them in, she said. Not ships. The ones that answer the light instead of fearing it. They come careful, like good weather coming out of bad, and then they stand under us and ask for names. Her voice went smaller on the last word, not with fear, with something close to grief that had learned humility. We don't give them. The pale knot hand pressed again, just shy of the iron. I felt the pressure in the bridges of my feet, in the soft meat of my palms. The voice rose as if to whisper into my mouth. Turn. My name followed. Not the one on tax forms, the one that lives between the last page of a book and the first sleep after. Hearing it there wore me thin. Evan's hand landed on my collar and backed me a step. Up, he said, and I stood because I was grateful to be made too. Orr reached past me, took the rope of the old bell, and struck it once. The sound did not ring so much as settle. The water below shivered, drew back, not anger, disappointment, practiced into courtesy. The voice sank into its own wetness until there was only the breathing of a thing trying to teach itself patience again. We came, it said, not aloud, not inside, but like a tide being honest. We saw, we will remember. Then the knot hand withdrew completely. The surface went black the way paper goes blank. We shut the door, or locked it. The key made the dull promise of iron doing its duty. On the stair, she put her palm to the stone and listened again. It's done, she said. For tonight. Not for good, Evan said, the way a person says he knows the weather will rain tomorrow because his knee has told him. Never for good, she said. We climbed back into the lantern's country. The beam moved with renewed authority, as if pleased by our decision to keep its grammar. The South took its usual extra syllable, and no more. The wrong fingerprint was gone from the glass, or else it had learned invisibility enough to not punish my cloth for seeking it. The radio slept. We held the hours until Gray pried the night open with a butter knife. When the world had edges again, I signed the log with a hand that shook and found the margin already occupied, in the fine, tidy script that wasn't ours. Thank you for listening. Under it, a smaller line, written as if by water trying a pencil. We keep watch too. I found Orr in the galley with her mug wrapped in both hands. How long? I asked. Since the first time. How long what? She answered. Because age trains you to demand precision as a form of mercy. How long have you been telling it no? Since I learned what yes does, she said. The answer didn't move the conversation forward. It prevented it from moving backward. Evan slept in the chair, mouth open, fingers curled as if holding a rope. The cat had arranged itself between his boots, like a spill. They were too tired to mop. Outside, the sea put away its night voice and made the day sound that passes for public decency. I went down to the keeper's room and let the bed remind me about horizontal. When I closed my eyes, the image came back. The knot hand pressing the iron, the bell's single humpbacked note, the way the light wanted to lengthen south, like a person leaning to hear a name. I understood then that the work was not polishing and logging and winding. The work was refusing to be thanked into obedience. The next night brought no storm, no bell from nowhere, only a fog that practiced truce and the small hiss of drizzle. The tower did not knock. The wrong print did not return. I let relief be an amateur and sat with it openly, elbows on the log desk, chin in my palm like a boy watching a grown man play cards and pretending to understand. At 2 against the rules, and because rules invite trespass when they're good ones, I turned the radio's volume until it almost existed. The static had texture. Under it, faint as thread, the same voice. No words this time, just a sound that wanted to be one. I turned it off before it finished. People who know their temperance know when to leave a glass half. At dawn, I walked the outside gallery. The iron smelled only of itself. The sea below had the gray-green of fatigued metal. On the south pane, at the height of my shoulder, a thin runnel of dried salt had tracked in 2 parallel lines, too straight to have been made by rain, too tidy to be accident, 2 lengths, 8 inches long, perfectly apart. I touched them with a knuckle and felt nothing but roughness. Inside the watchroom, the cat opened one eye and decided I was acceptable. The beam, sleeping, held its last thought in the ribs of the lens. I carried the cloth around one more time, and when I came to the south, I didn't wipe. I laid the cloth on the rail and stood with both hands on the brass and said, very quietly, "We see you." It felt like a betrayal to say it, and a betrayal not to. The glass did not fog. The horizon did not answer. From below came the steady breathing of the arithmetic, the rock and sea do together. When Orr relieved me, she put 2 fingers to the glass where the runnels were and nodded. "They're learning our corners," she said. "We're learning theirs." She exhaled, as if relieved to still be the teacher. "When I die," she added, conversational and immediate, "this will be yours if you want it." "What if I don't?" I asked, startled into honesty by her certainty. "Then it will still be yours for a while," she said, "until the lamp decides otherwise. Lights pick their people. Don't let anyone tell you about committees and funding. It's glass and oil, and metal and attention, choosing who will tell the dark its name." "I don't want to be chosen," I said, and heard the childishness again, and recognized its need for a parent who could not be provided. "Then make the light say no with you," she said, "every night. It's the only prayer that works here." That evening, a modest swell made its polite changes along the rock, and the lamp respected its own math, and the horn slept. At 9, out beyond where the chart admits you can stand, a dark column paused, as if considering again whether to be a door. It didn't come nearer. The beam curved its white arm and did not reach. The radio stayed down. At 11:30, a small, careful knocking happened far below, like forgiveness. I counted, and on 12 I did not move. The knock ceased. I wrote that down too and underlined it, not because I feared forgetting, but because I wanted the book to learn the shape of refusal as clearly as it had learned the shape of weather. I slept better, and when I woke with my face turned toward the window, the tide had left a gift on the lowest step outside the base door, a length of rope knotted in a pattern I half knew and could not name, or called it a Matthew Walker, then frowned and said no, it had more turns than that. It smelled of tar and brine and old stories. We hung it on a hook where the cat couldn't claim it, and it dripped like something that had been elevated from a language you only partly speak. Days passed that were only days. Evenings passed that reminded me how quickly a tower learns a man's weight. Some nights the wrong print returned, and I wiped it, and the cloth kept its secrets. Some nights a bell sounded very far, and I pretended not to admire its pitch. Once, on a morning so clear the mainland seemed to have put on cologne and come courting, the margin held a single, almost playful line in the stranger's tidy hand. "We like how you clean." It would have been funny if it hadn't also been flattering, and if flattery hadn't been the exact tool I feared in the mouth that was mostly water. On the 4th week, a storm announced itself with the courtesy of a letter of introduction, and then arrived early out of spite. The lamp ran hot. The horn worked. The radio muttered a string of numbers that didn't belong to any buoy. The beam pulled south like a dog that had picked up a scent. When the 3rd knock came that night, I knew exactly which door to open and which to lock, and how long to count, and what the bell wanted me to refuse. I went down with Orr, and Evan braced himself like furniture, and the pale knot hand touched the iron through the language of water, and the voice used my name and then put it down gently when I didn't offer it back. We kept our no. The light did its job. In the log I wrote, visibility poor, horn as required, wrong prints increased, refused. In the margin later, where I wouldn't see it until morning, we keep watch too. Thank you. The sea does not have to be malicious to be dangerous. The dark does not have to be empty to deserve your respect. The light does not have to be kind to be holy. I learned those sentences the way a body learns stairs. When Orr slept, I sat with the lamp and wiped the glass in the exact cadence we had decided belongs to safety. When Evan fixed hinges that had not yet chosen to complain, I handed him tools as if assistance could be taught into permanence. When the radio cleared its throat at 2, I turned it off. When the wrong fingerprint brightened, I made it go away, knowing it would not go far. On a calm, humiliatingly gorgeous afternoon, near the end of my first month, the ferry came in with groceries and mail, and a woman in a red coat who took photographs of the tower as if photographs could keep the weather from eating paint, or signed for parcels. Evan flirted fluently with anyone who smiled. I carried flour and tinned fish and a packet from the Coast Guard with a form that asked the lamp to quantify itself. The island smelled of rope and summer that hadn't decided whether to arrive. For an hour we were an ordinary outpost with ordinary jobs, and my hands were only hands. That night, when the fog came soft as wool and the beam laid its white thread along the horizon, when no radio spoke and no bell answered, when the knock did not come at 9 or 10 or 11, the glass stayed clean and the log stayed dull, I should have felt reprieve. Instead, I felt watched from far away by a patience that had time enough to show me good nights as well as bad, so that when the next bad one came, I would be tempted to call it balance instead of appetite. I stood at the south pane and put my palm an inch from the glass, but did not touch, remembering Orr's warning about the wrong contact. "We see you," I said again, quiet as weather. The sea below made no answer, but its breathing, far out, where water becomes idea, and then becomes map, and then becomes superstition. Something upright paused, as if it had been told a very good joke, and wanted to share it with someone who refused to laugh. Then it lowered itself with the grace of tide, and disappeared, leaving only the sense that the lamp had been admired. I logged the hour. I wound the story into the next, and I thought about how the beam insists on the south for a fraction longer than any blueprint would prescribe. I thought of the bowl in the chapel of another place and the arithmetic of drops. I thought of how refusal is a practice, not an event. I thought about leaving when my month ended, and I thought about the way the tower had learned my feet on its stairs, and how lights pick their people, and how roads pick their departures, and how certain voices say come about, not as order, but as compliment. I held my no with both hands, the way you hold a baby or a lantern in wind, and the sea polite because it was in a good mood. Let me. The last week began with the kind of sky that makes promises it doesn't intend to keep. Clear, generous, a blue that ran without edges, as though the sea had borrowed part of the heavens and held it ransom. The gulls wheeled without complaint. The cat found a warm coil of rope and slept in a posture so complete it looked sculpted. Even Orr's shoulders looked less carved from salt and more borrowed from rest. "These are the days that trick you," she said, spooning porridge into her bowl. "Good weather makes you forget the work." Evan laughed, but it was the nervous kind. A man who knew calm was only the overture before a storm. We worked like people pretending there was nothing under the tower but rock. I polished the brass until it reflected my jaw like a mask. Evan sorted the pantry, lined tins into soldier rows, or adjusted the weight and the clockwork and checked the wick twice, though the motor had long been sworn in. Every act was a ritual of maintenance, the tower's body receiving the careful ministrations of its keepers. Yet in every quiet moment I felt it, the listening, the sea waiting, patient as moss, under the floorboards of the world. At dusk the beam stretched itself with the familiar reluctance of a giant waking. It turned, smooth as breath, steady as law. On the southward swing it lingered its fraction too long, and I told myself not to count the seconds, or poured coffee and lit her pipe with the air of a woman daring weather to contradict her. The lamp behaves when she knows she's admired, she said. It's the attention that matters. At 9, the knock came again. Not polite, not violent, curious, at the base like a fist testing the size of the door it wishes to claim. I counted. Evan counted. On 12, silence. No second knock. The log swallowed the entry without protest. I wanted to believe it was nothing more than wind-shifting stone, but when I climbed to wipe the glass, the print was there again. This time it wasn't a hand. It was a face pressed close, long, narrow, the impression of features stretched wrong, an oval mouth, wide and too still. I wiped it, but the cloth came away wet with something that smelled like the tide when it's eating drowned wood. Midnight dragged itself over the sea like a sheet soaked through. The fog came, thick and deliberate, swallowing even the sound of the horn. Oars Ito roamed, and Evan hauled the chain like a man praying with his muscles. The horn bellowed too long, one short, but the sound didn't carry. It stopped, muffled, as if something pressed a hand over the tower's mouth. Orr's eyes flicked to mine, and in them was a truth I hadn't been prepared to inherit. We were not the only ones keeping watch. The radio woke, not static this time, not the drawn-out syllables of come about, a chorus, dozens of voices, layered, each one speaking in time with the sea's breath. Not words, but vowels drawn long, as if the ocean itself were learning to form language. The sound filled the lantern room until my teeth hurt. I reached for the dial. Orr's hand caught mine. Let them talk, she said. The beam slowed, not stopped, not stalled, slowed. Its rotation dragged. The motor whined, though nothing was broken. It stretched its southern arc longer and longer until the light leaned into the fog like a body leaning into the arms of another. Shapes moved there, not ships, not birds, upright, tall as masts, thin as prayers, walking where water shouldn't allow feet. Dozens, perhaps more. Each time the beam swept, they turned their heads toward us, faces pale as the fingerprints, eyes reflecting nothing but our own light. Don't open the hatch, Orr said, her voice level as iron. Don't answer. Don't stand too close. The chorus rose, and in it I heard my name again. Not my ordinary name, the secret one, the one that belongs only to me in the silence before sleep. It rose from 100 throats at once, stretched into music, offered back like a blessing. My knees went weak. Evan gripped my arm hard enough to bruise. That's how they catch you, he said. They remind you of yourself. The fog pressed harder. The tower shivered. Water wept from the seams between stones. The knock came again, urgent, hammering from everywhere at once, not just the base, midway, high up, the spiral stair vibrating with impact. I counted, my mouth moving soundlessly, but there was no 12. Every number stretched, repeated, fractured. 1 came after 1, 2 returned after 4, 6 rang like a bell. The arithmetic failed me. Orr stood and struck the old bell. Once, twice. The sound cut through everything, clean and undeniable. The fog recoiled an inch. The chorus wavered. The prints on the glass multiplied, dozens of ovals blooming, palms and fingers and faces pressing from outside, making the lantern room look submerged. I wiped until the cloth tore, but they came back faster. The smell of salt and iron filled my lungs. Then the beam flared. A burst of light so pure it blinded me. It spun once, fast, furious, defiant, and the fog screamed. Yes, screamed. Not wind, not horn, but 1,000 voices suddenly refusing harmony. Shapes flinched and dissolved. The pressure against the stone lessened. The radio cut to silence. The tower breathed again. When my sight returned, the glass was clear. The fog thinned. The sea rolled in honest gray. Only the smell lingered. Or sank into her chair, pipe cold in her hand. That's what yes looks like, she said. Now you know why we never give it. We logged the night with hands that trembled, visibility poor, prints multiplied, interference on radio, refusal held. In the margin, the tidy handwriting waited. We will ask again, under it smaller, fainter, as if scratched by water itself. You will turn. At dawn the ferry came, oblivious, bright against the horizon. Supplies, mail, the ordinary world tugging at us. The woman in the red coat waved, camera flashing. Evan muttered curses at the cheer of it, or signed for crates with her usual dry authority. I carried flour up the path and wondered how many people on that ferry had felt their names spoken in their sleep without knowing why. That evening, I stood alone in the lantern room before the lamp was lit. I pressed my palm to the south pane where the prints had bloomed. Nothing answered. Not yet. I thought of the wrong fingerprints, the pale knot hand, the rope knotted in patterns I couldn't name, the chorus calling my hidden name. I thought of how refusal is a prayer, repeated until it becomes muscle. I thought of how lights choose their keepers. When the lamp bloomed, I whispered, "We see you." And then, with all the steadiness I could muster, no. The beam turned. South it lingered, just long enough to remind me what waits. Then it moved on, faithful, patient, inexhaustible. The sea breathed, the tower held. I logged the hour, the weather, the refusal. And in the margin, faint enough I could almost pretend it wasn't there. Thank you for keeping watch. I closed the book, wiped the glass, and let the night be what it was, endless, listening, hungry, and because we said no, still ours. Now, on to the next story. The bus dropped me at a stop that might once have had a sign. Salt lived in everything, the faded bench, the splintered post, the grass that leaned as if the wind had taught it manners. The sea lay out past a tangle of low roofs and nets, silver gray and patient. I'd come because the city had been shouting for months, and I'd started shouting back without moving my lips. A friend of a friend said there was a coastal town where time forgot to hurry. There were rooms to let above the old chandlery. Quiet enough to sleep to, she joked, and something in me, tired and reckless, took the phrase literally. I dragged my duffel along a lane that narrowed until the houses had to behave like neighbors. Windows watched but didn't judge. Someone had hung fish to dry. They spun slowly, as if the air had its own slow conversations. The wind brought me church bell smell, old wood, beeswax, the breath of stone, and then the quick tarry tang of boats. Half the doors were painted the same stubborn blue. I began to think I had made a good choice. The chandlery had a sign so worn it looked like an old scar. The window displayed ropes in even coils, pulleys that remembered weight, glass floats with their nets like cradles. Inside, light fell in tall, slanted sheets and showed dust floating the way minutes do when they have nowhere else to be. A bell I couldn't see announced me with a thin, polite chime. Upstairs, someone called, and I found the staircase by finding the smell of lemon oil in old steps. The boards announced me to the building. The top landing opened onto a hall that had learned to be narrow in the right places. A woman was there, expecting me with the patient air of someone who has seen all the versions of Arrival. Her hair was the color of driftwood that had spent a season pretending to be a tree again. She wore a cardigan that had outlived 3 winters and decided this one could be easy. "You're the one who needs quiet," she said without malice. I kept the back room, best for sleeping. You won't hear the bell except when it wants to be heard. I don't mind bells, I said, because talking about bells is easier than talking about why you've come. She studied my face the way people in small places learn to do, with kindness that is not the same as softness. Everyone minds bells in the end, she said, and handed me a key tied to a length of braided cord. The room was tidy in a way that had nothing to do with rules, and everything to do with respect. Bed, small desk, chair with a cushion that remembered other people's careful bones. A window faced the water past the roofs, and when I opened it, the sea answered with a cool breath. The walls had been painted cream long enough ago that the color had decided to stay. In one corner, a shape under a cloth suggested a small cabinet or a large radio. I lifted the cloth and found a ship's clock the size of a dinner plate, brass that had dulled into elegance. The face was porcelain, hairline cracked like an old smile. The hands stood at 12 and 12, as if noon and midnight had found a truce. I touched the glass with one finger because sometimes it matters that something is real. My finger left no print. The glass felt colder than the room. A small key sat upright on the cabinet beside it, like a guest with perfect posture. I did not wind it, not because of superstition. Superstition arrives later, but because silence was the point of this trip, and I didn't want a ticking to keep me company if I wasn't the one who'd invited it. In the evening, I walked down to the harbor, where the boats leaned on the water like men waiting to confess, and then decided against it. Nets were spread like lace and weighted with stones that remembered the hands that had chosen them. Children played a game that involved chasing gulls and pretending to be surprised by their laughter. The pub door sagged with the weight of its own stories. Warm light framed shoulders, caps, the brief flash of teeth in a joke that didn't need words. I bought bread that looked like it knew how to be bread and cheese that tried to leak, and a small jar of pickled something that the shopkeeper promised would keep you honest. Honest seemed like a lot to ask from a jar, but I took it anyway. Back upstairs, I ate at the desk with the window open just enough to let the sea count without my help. The air moved through the curtains like a patient hand smoothing someone's hair. The town made its small mechanical sounds, gate latches, the shy clink of china, a cough from someone who didn't believe in closing windows, and then decided it had said enough. Night came without ceremony. I boiled water in the tiny kettle the landlady had left, its spout the shape of something trying to remember a bird. The tea tasted like leaves remembering sun. I slept, not perfectly. Sleep has to be coaxed and reminded and forgiven, but in large, decent pieces. I woke once to the far bell agreeing with the hour, once to the ferry's horn, and once to nothing at all, which is my favorite thing to wake to. In the morning, the mirror showed a face that had set a few burdens down and was pretending not to look back to make sure they stayed. The landlady met me on the stairs with a plate of something that had begun as scones, and then changed its mind halfway to becoming biscuits. "Town's small on first days," she said, as if giving directions. "It gets bigger if you're polite." "I can be polite," I said, and the ease in her eyes suggested that she believed me, or that it wouldn't matter if she didn't. The day arranged itself the way good days do, without asking your permission. I walked the long curve of the seawall, with my hands in my pockets, like someone from a painting. I watched a man mend a net with the tenderness of a tailor and the focus of a surgeon. I let a dog make up its mind about me and wag when it decided in my favor. At the far end of the wall, a lighthouse lifted itself like a polite finger. It was not tall, but it had that dignity some buildings acquire when they've watched long enough. A lightkeeper's house sat close by, now boarded, with its shingles painted that stubborn blue the town loved. The boards were clean and recent. Someone had felt responsible. On my way back, I noticed a building I'd missed, not because it hovered or glowed or spoke, but because it failed to do all three and thus hid in the space your mind leaves for unimportant things. It sat at the landward end of a narrow street that didn't like being a street. The facade was brick, the color of dried blood. Two windows stared at nothing, and between them a doorway taller than needed wore a faded lintel that might have once told a name. I would have walked past if the air hadn't changed. The way rooms change when you open a door to the hall and your body recognizes other breathing. I felt watched from inside by something that didn't care whether I came in or not. When I reached the chandlery, the landlady was at the counter, turning a coil of rope, the way one might turn a thought. "You found the lighthouse," she said without asking. Salt had tattled on me. "Stay away from the steps after rain. They go loose." "I saw a boarded house," I said, "by the light." "Boarded things have their reasons," she said, as if that could be the end of it. "And down by the long net shed," I added carefully, "there's a brick building, tall doorway." Her hand slowed on the rope, only a fraction. "There is," she agreed, with the neutrality of someone describing weather that wasn't hers. "Used to be the signal hall, then a schoolroom for a bit when the church roof tried being a sieve. Then it was nothing for longer. It changes its mind. Can it be visited? It can be looked at," she said, and left it there, which is a form of generosity. That night the wind came up and played the chimneys like awkward flutes. The sea changed its mind about patience and fussed against the wall. Above the cabinet, the ship's clock faced the room with the composure of a portrait. I sat on the edge of the bed and felt that particular loneliness you get in new rooms, the kind that isn't about missing people, but about missing your own outline. To make an outline, I decided to do something ordinary. I put the key in the clock's small mouth. The resistance was intimate, like turning a ring on a swollen finger. The mainspring took the wind in steady swallows. A sound rose that was not a sound yet, the promise tucked deep in the brass. When it was enough, I stopped. I rested my thumb on the glass as if taking a pulse. For a breath, nothing, then the most courteous tick, a polite nib at the edge of the room, another precisely following, as if the first had invited a friend. The hands did not move, the ticks did. I watched long enough to understand that time would agree to be lived here on terms I could live with. I slept with that permission. The dream, when it came, arrived like a visitor who knows the back stairs. I stood by the seawall at a tide my waking feet did not know. The water had drawn away until the harbor showed its bones, posts furry with weed, stone teeth, forgotten ladders. People moved on the wet sand with the slowness of those who work inside weather. Their clothes belonged to another century, but their hands did not. They were simply human, and work makes time behave. A bell rang, not from the church, not from a boat. It rang once, a note fat with iron, and the working slowed. Another ring, and the slowing became stillness. Heads lifted. No one looked at the sound. They looked toward the land. I turned with them. The brick building stood where it stands. The tall doorway was filled with nothing, or with the idea of a person. My dream eyes could not decide. The air between the doorway and the stopped people tightened. A woman beside me, dream woman, old, with a scarf tied like a habit of mind, touched my sleeve with 2 fingers. "Go careful," she said, and though we had not been speaking, the kindness of warning lived in her voice. It hears itself when there's a storm. I woke with my skin remembering wet. The room held together around me, politely, tenderly. The tick continued, unchanged. Dawn had laid a soft hand along the window frame. The light had that infant tint that makes you forgive everything. I went down early because being among old wood felt like medicine, and because the landlady's kettle made a noise that hurt my bones. "You look like something spoke your name, and you pretended not to hear," she said, handing me a mug that could have been a bowl if it had tried harder. Storm dreams. They come on strong when the wind goes east. There was a bell, I said, not the church. The signal bell, she said. Before we had wires, before the wires decided to be lazy. You heard what the town used to hear when the sea had an argument with itself. Funny for you to hear it now. We've not had a proper east wind night in weeks. You heard it? I asked, because shared delusion is easier to carry than the solitary kind. We always hear it, she said, and then smiled in a way that could be an apology. We've learned to be polite to it. After breakfast, I took the long route that pretends not to end at the brick building, and then does. The lane pinched, the ivy leaned, the daylight became selective. Up close, the bricks were handmade, pocked and irregular, each one containing its own small history of heat. The lintel had letters if you let your eyes squint. I didn't. The doorway, taller than any door the town owned now, stood open to shadow. The interior smelled like old paper, minerals, and a hint of salt that had learned manners. I didn't cross the threshold, not because I was wise, but because I wanted to keep the option of caution. I stood in the mouth of it and let my eyes do the work. Benches, narrow, their surfaces polished by vanished patience. A table at the front where someone once sat to tell the weather what story it was allowed to be. A rack where flags might have hung, their meaning retired. On the right-hand wall, the ghost of a chalkboard drew a rectangle so convincing that my brain wrote letters on it and then was embarrassed. In the back, near the high windows, a rope hung as if it had just remembered gravity. It moved once in a breath that did not belong to me. Every place has its own quiet. This quiet liked to be counted, and suddenly I understood why I had wound the clock, why I slept at all. Counting makes a shape. Shapes keep you. I counted the sounds I could hear, and did not add numbers to the ones my mind tried to invent. The hum of a fly that had gotten old in the same room, the shift of a board that disliked damp, a far gull deciding that complaining wasn't worth it. 3, 4, 5. The rope did not move again, which seemed like a courtesy extended. Looking, someone said behind me, and I turned too quickly and did that flinch you do when you expect a stranger and find one who thinks you know them. He was a man in his 60s with the contented muscle of someone who still lifts things the right way. He wore a cap that had belonged to his father. I could see the inheritance in the way his head fit beneath its brim. He nodded toward the interior. It makes you polite, doesn't it? I thought that was me, I said. It is, until it isn't, he answered, and then stuck out a hand with a name attached. I took it and gave mine back. He rolled my name on his tongue like something he might offer to a friend later, and then tipped his chin toward the sea. You'll know it by noon, he said. The wind's gone nervy. Don't stand under the big door after 3. It drops its own shade when it's cross. The practical absurdity of the warning worked better than a story. I'll keep to the small doors, I promised. He smiled as if I had passed a test he hadn't meant me to take. That'll keep you, he said, and went on his way the way people in small places do, with purpose you can't quite see but believe in. I left the threshold and stepped into the day like stepping into a coat you hope will fit. The town went about its business with the neat choreography of habit. Children ran and didn't fall. Women leaned on door frames and wiped their hands. Men counted something invisible with their eyes and found it satisfactory. By noon, the wind had indeed gone nervy. It worried ropes and made the gulls change their minds mid-sentence. Clouds lined up in a way that suggested gossip. Back in my room, the clock ticked with the same courteous rhythm, as if untouched by any other pulse. I put the key beside it and sat at the desk and wrote nothing, which is a kind of writing. The open window let in a sliver of the town's collective breath. The brass face held the room. The hands still pointed at 12, perfectly balanced, as though time here was a coin stood on edge and too polite to fall. I meant to nap and instead watched the way light goes tender at the edges of afternoon. A smell like wet iron arrived ahead of any rain. Somewhere a door shut with more meaning than necessary. When the first drop hit the sill, the second didn't wait. The storm tightened the world the way a belt tightens a coat. I closed the window halfway, and the sound of the rain became the sound of someone hushing a room. The clock ticked on. The rope in the signal hall would be moving, I thought, without knowing why I'd thought it. I told myself to stay where I was, to be grateful for a room that was on my side. The bell rang. Not the church, not the ferry. A single fat note, iron-fed and sure, that came from a place I could have pointed to if I had let my hand betray me. The sound sat in the air like a guest who'd taken the best chair. The second ring followed, and with it the old dream sensation, the town deciding to hold its breath. Footsteps paused, words finished themselves early, rain reconsidered. There was a space shaped like listening. I stood without meaning to. My hand found the key, because hands are old creatures and love talismans. I didn't lock the door. I wasn't leaving. I only wanted the small weight of intention in my fingers. The clock did not hurry or slow. It ticked the way the sea breathes when it sleeps. I counted the silence after the second bell, because counting gives quiet a spine. 1, 2, 3. Somewhere downstairs the landlady moved a chair slightly out of true. 4, 5, 6. The seventh beat never arrived because the third bell came then, and it contained something the others hadn't, a decision made somewhere else. I thought of the tall doorway, and the rope, and the advice about small doors. I was not going out into the rain. I was not going down to stand under anything. I was going to sit on my bed like a person who wants to keep being a person, and wait until the hour went back to being an hour instead of a mouth. The fourth bell climbed the stairs without feet. It set itself gently on the cabinet, as if the brass could keep it company. The key in my hand warmed, the way metal does when it agrees with you. I breathed in time with the tick and out in time with the rain. It is astonishing how much a body can teach you when you stop telling it what to do. The fifth bell didn't come. The quiet that followed it had edges. They were not sharp. They were precise. I thought, without wanting to, of the brick building and its shadow-dropping temper. I thought of the town's practiced politeness, of the way people look at weather as if it were not outside them. I thought of the dream and the woman who had touched my sleeve and told me to go careful. The sixth bell arrived late, as if it had had to be convinced. The seventh came right behind it, almost apologetic. The eighth was far away, a rumor. The ninth was so close I knew exactly where it had been rung. The 10th held breath and let it go. 11 never bothered. 12 happened inside the clock without moving the hands. I sat on the bed until my body realized that sitting was an action and would have to be paid for later. When the rain softened, I stood and opened the window again. The town exhaled. A child cried in the way children cry when no one is hurt. Boots went down steps. The sea returned to its muttering. The clock ticked on, kind and exact. That night I slept badly, because sometimes the cost is not fear, but wakefulness. I woke to the sound of net floats knocking together like old friends, then to nothing, then to the particular whisper of a foot on the hall, the landlady's, measured and soft. Near dawn I dreamed again, not of work on the sand, not of people stopping mid-gesture, but of standing in the tall doorway and being tall enough for it. The rope lifted, as if a hand were under it. I put my hand where a hand might be, and felt something like breath pass through. It didn't belong to me, and it didn't ask to. It just went on. When I woke, my palm tingled the way it does after you snap a matchstick and don't light it. By morning, the town had decided to pretend the storm had been polite. The landlady set a mug in front of me and asked if I'd slept, and when I shook my head, she nodded like a woman agreeing with weather. It hears itself in the rain, she said again, as if reminding me of a rule I had already been taught. And when it hears itself, it's best to count your own house. I carried my mug to the window and looked at the water that was already forgetting. The brick building sat as it sits. The doorway was a mouth closed on its own opinions. I told myself I would not go near it until the wind had changed, until the town had stopped holding its breath. I told myself I would be the sort of person who stays in when the old bell tries to organize you. I finished my tea, thanked the landlady, and put on my coat. Outside, the air had been laundered. The gulls had forgiven the wind. I walked with my hands in my pockets and told the day I was only going as far as the seawall. It agreed to believe me. I did what people do when they are going to break a rule. I made a smaller rule first and kept it. I stood on the wall and counted waves. I touched the iron rail and did not lick the salt from my fingers. I waved at the dog that had accepted me. I turned inland when I said I would. I walked up the lane that pretends not to lead to the brick building at all. Somewhere behind me, the clock upstairs ticked 2 careful beats I did not hear. Somewhere ahead of me, the rope in the signal hall moved without learning anything new. I stopped at the doorway and stood under the small overhang that keeps rain puzzled. I did not go inside. I waited until the town's breathing matched mine. Then I spoke in a voice that surprised me with its calm. "I'm only looking," I said to no one, and to the building, and to a version of myself that needed to hear it. "I'll be polite." A draft crossed my face with the temperature of an old cellar. The boards underfoot made a sound like a memory getting up from a chair. Far inside the room, something that had been thinking for a long time decided to listen. I did not step over the threshold. I looked. I let the room look back. And somewhere beneath the floorboards, faint and steady and impossible, I heard a ticking that did not belong to my clock at all. The rope in the signal hall didn't move again while I stood there, and that felt like a kindness, the sort a place gives you when it wants to see if you'll take advantage. I kept my hands in my pockets and let the doorway frame the dark. If I leaned even a fraction, I would cross from polite visitor to something else, and I suspected the difference mattered more here than anywhere else I'd been. A gull cried above, sounding like it had forgotten the script. I turned away before the town decided I had overstayed. The lane welcomed me back without ceremony, narrow and damp-smelling, ivy heavy with last night's storm. The sky was clearing in streaks, pale blue showing between veils of cloud, and the sea, though restless, seemed to be forgiving. My feet carried me back to the chandlery as if it had been written in the floorboards. Inside, the air was warmer, scented with salt and rope and the faint citrus tang of the oil the landlady used. She was behind the counter winding twine with patient fingers, eyes narrowing slightly when she saw me. "You've been where you shouldn't," she said, not as an accusation but as a statement of geography. "I only looked," I admitted. "That's how it begins," she replied, but not unkindly. She tapped the counter once with the flat of her hand, the way you quiet a table of children. "There are rules. If you keep them, you'll find sleep. If you don't, you'll find stories. Stories don't let people rest." I wanted to ask her what rules, but the look she gave me told me she wouldn't answer in a list. She would wait for me to discover them, the way you wait for a child to understand that the stove is hot without saying the word burn. I went upstairs instead, feeling the old wood creak underfoot, the ship's clock keeping time in polite, exact strokes. It hadn't moved its hands from 12, but the ticking was steady as a heartbeat. The day stretched itself lazily. I tried to write, filling a page with words that looked like ants fleeing in different directions. They meant nothing, but the act steadied me. When my eyes grew heavy, I closed the notebook and stared at the brass clock face. I wondered who had first set it here, whether it had been gift or relic, whether it had arrived with its rules already attached. It ticked without hurry, each sound distinct enough to count, each count building a shape that felt more solid than the walls. By late afternoon, the air outside thickened again, as if the storm had been called back for an encore. The wind pressed against the shutters, and the gulls wheeled low, voicing their complaints. I stepped into the street and found the town subdued, doors closed, nets tied down, voices muffled behind glass. At the harbor, the boats strained at their lines like dogs that had caught the scent of something larger. The lighthouse stood steady, its boarded neighbor staring at nothing. The brick building at the far end of the net sheds seemed to grow taller with each gust, the doorway blacker than it had been that morning. I forced myself past it without looking, though the urge to glance sideways tugged at me like a hand on my coat. Back at the chandlery, the landlady was waiting with 2 mugs of tea already steaming. She handed me one, as though she had expected my return to be timed with the weather. "Storm's turning," she said. "When the east wind comes back, don't answer the bell." "I didn't last night," I said. "You woke," she replied. "That's answer enough." The storm broke just after dark, hurling itself at the roofs, rattling the windows, forcing the town to huddle against itself. Rain struck the shutters like handfuls of thrown gravel. I sat by the bed, the clock beside me, and listened as the storm tried to decide how loud it wanted to be. The first bell came as before, low and iron-fed, vibrating through the floorboards. It rang only once this time, and the silence after it was longer, heavier, more certain. My pulse tripped over itself. I pressed my palm to the brass clock, grounding myself in its steady rhythm. The second bell followed, and the storm seemed to pause to listen. The town below me stilled. I imagined every family sitting as I was, waiting, counting, holding their breath, as if their lungs could help keep the buildings upright. A third bell came, slower, dragging itself into the air like a chain pulled from water. My skin prickled. I thought of the rope in the hall moving with no wind, of the way the doorway had seemed to darken as I stood before it. I didn't speak. I didn't move. I counted. 4, 5, 6. The ship's clock ticked evenly, as if reminding me that one set of rules had not changed. 7, 8, 9. The bells stopped. The rain returned to its clattering fury, but the silence that had stretched between those notes remained under everything like an undertow beneath waves. When sleep came, it did not come gently. I dreamed of the hall again. This time I stood inside it, though I knew I had not crossed the threshold. The benches were full of people whose faces blurred, their bodies still as statues. The rope swung in the center, slow and pendulum steady, though no bell was visible. The air felt thick, as though it had been folded too many times. I turned toward the tall doorway, but instead of shadow, I saw water pressing against it, held back by nothing but will. The sea itself waited on the other side, patient and immense. A hand brushed my shoulder, and I turned to see the dream woman again, scarf tied close, her eyes dark with warning. "Do not answer," she whispered, and the whole hall whispered with her, voices layering until they became the storm. I woke with the echo of it in my ears, my heart hammering against the cage of my ribs. Morning came reluctantly. The town was washed clean, but carried the tiredness of having braced itself all night. I walked the lanes and nodded to the people I passed. They nodded back with the weary solidarity of those who had shared the same unspoken vigil. At the harbor, the boats sagged against their lines, exhausted animals. Nets hung limp, their colors muted by rain. The brick building stood unchanged, though I thought I saw a faint dampness on the lintel, as if it had drunk deeply and not wiped its mouth. The man in the cap appeared again, carrying a coil of rope over one shoulder. "You're still here," he said, as if that surprised him. "I'm still here," I agreed. "Then you've been polite enough," he said, setting the rope down to adjust his cap. "But mind yourself, it only gets hungrier." "What does?" I asked, though I already knew he would not answer. He gave me a look, sharp but not unkind. "You don't have to name it. Naming's half the invitation." He walked on, leaving me with the smell of salt and tar, and the realization that everyone in this town lived by rules they could not write down. rules you only learned by surviving the nights. Back in my room, the clock ticked steadily. Its hands had not moved, still fixed at 12 and 12, but I felt the minutes piling up in its rhythm. I wound it again, carefully, respectfully, and for a moment the storm dream seemed to loosen its grip. But as dusk approached, the air thickened once more, and I knew the night would not let me rest so easily. The third morning wore the same pale light as the first, but it knew me now. The town's faces knew me too, by the small adjustments people make when a stranger becomes part of the weather. The landlady set a saucer beside my mug without looking up. The way you put out water for a cat that has been visiting. Wind turned last night, she said, and the way she said it made me taste east on the back of my tongue. It'll try again tonight. They always try in threes. How many threes? I asked. As many as it needs to remember itself, she replied, finishing a neat knot and pulling the rope to test it, and as many as you need to remember yourself. I carried my tea to the window and watched the harbor remember how to breathe. Men coiled lines with hands that had learned patience from storms. Women beat rugs as if shaking sleep from them. Children stole each other's games and then traded them back. It would have been a comfort if comfort had been what I was here to find. Sleep is not comfort. Sleep is permission. There is a difference. I left the mug and walked the town with an intention I didn't entirely trust. I told myself I was looking for bread, for eggs, for something that tasted like morning. The truth was that my feet were going to the brick building because the part of me that insisted on politeness was losing to the part that insisted on knowing what rules I was being asked to keep. The lane narrowed, and the doorway grew out of it like a conclusion. The threshold held. The inside had shifted, but in the way a room shifts when light changes. Everything in its place, but the place has learned a new expression. Dust motes hung squarely in a shaft of sun that found a high window and tested the air. The rope was still, but its stillness looked rehearsed. Benches waited with the patience of objects that have outlived owners. The chalkboard's ghost was less shy. Someone had dragged a fingertip across it recently, or last century. The space made its own time. I had the sense that if I stayed long enough, it would teach me to count differently. On the back wall, half hidden behind a stack of wooden crates, a cabinet stood like a person trying not to be asked a question. It was tall and narrow with a glass front gone smoky, its brass latch the only piece that remembered brightness. I told myself I would not touch it. I told myself I would only look the way I had promised. I stepped closer and found a ledger inside, bound in cracked leather, the color of dried kelp. No name lay on its spine. I didn't reach for it. The latch was a polite puzzle. I solved it without hearing the sound of my own breath deciding. The ledger was heavier than it looked. It had that weight some objects carry when they have not just recorded time, but stored it. When I opened it, the hinges sighed like old knees. Ink had been steady and modest here. Names of boats, dates, and weathers, notes on fog, on visibility, on the temperaments of distant shoals. Between the practical lines, a different hand had written quieter words, small script that had wanted to hide. It spoke of bells rung on still days, of a rope that moved when it shouldn't, of a doorway that made men feel tall or small, depending on whether they lied to it. The hand never signed itself. The entries came irregularly, like a confession given when courage was cheap. I read until my eyes felt salted. One line caught and stayed. We answer and we pay. We don't answer and we pay. The next line was a correction. Neither is free, but one lets us count our own houses. I closed the book because closing a book is sometimes the only respectful thing left to do. Found her, did you? A voice said, and I turned, guilt climbing my cheeks as if it had nails. The man in the cap stood in the doorway, hands empty, hat brim shading an expression that didn't require much of his face. She writes to keep the building honest. She? I asked too quickly, betraying the hope that the ledger had a shape beyond ink and weather. The keeper's girl, he said, not the child of his house, the child of the place. Every hall has one when it's busy, someone the wood talks to when there's no one else listening. They get good at not telling what they know. They get better at telling the page. You read enough of her and you'll begin to hear her walk. I didn't mean to, I began, and he cut me off with a small motion, a kindness for my clumsy apology. It's why it's there, he said. An unlocked cabinet is its own instruction. Just remember to put it back where the room can find it. He stepped inside for the first time since I'd known him, and the hall accepted him the way a chair accepts an owner. He didn't hurry. He walked the aisle as if blessing benches. At the rope he stopped and set his palm against it, not moving it, letting the rope recognize his hand and decide to be still. We used to ring for ships, he said to the air. Then we rang for weather. Now and then we ring for ourselves, so we don't forget there's a difference. Do you ring when it storms? I asked. We ring when it's quiet enough to hear us, he said. Storms do their own ringing. He gave the rope a friendly pat. You'll hear it sing to itself when it's bored. That's when you leave it alone. He glanced at the ledger and at me, not disapproving, not approving, just measuring the space between me and the room. You wound the time upstairs, he added. Good. It's an old clock. It needs company more than key. How did you? He smiled with half his mouth. Town tells, he said. Rooms tell better. He tipped his cap a fraction and left the hall without looking back, which struck me as the bravest way to exit a place like this. I put the ledger gently where it had stood, smoothed the leather spine as if stroking a cat, and latched the cabinet with the modest firmness of someone who has practiced becoming a better guest. Outside, the day had learned to squint. A high haze flattened distance. The lighthouse's white looked less like paint and more like bone. I walked down to the seawall and let the water do its old trick of forgiving everything. In that forgiving, I felt the pull of the boarded house beside the light. It had the particular magnetism of doors that used to be used and now were not. I stood at its fence and looked without trespassing. 4 windows to a face, blind, a roof that had argued with the wind and lost a few shingles, steps leading to a porch that had memorized feet. An old bronze plaque kept its own counsel beside the gate. I leaned only close enough to read the years the house had been a house, the name of a keeper who had outlived 2 storms and been outlived by a third, and a line that did not make itself important, but was family quarters closed. That last word hummed, the way certain words hum when they are trying to be several things at once. I turned away before I had to guess which 2. Back at the chandlery, the landlady was mending a net that was too pretty to go near fish. You'll have found paper in the hall, she said. Not a question. It reads like listening, I said. That's what good writing is, she answered. Listening with a place instead of to it. She worked 3 clean stitches and bit off the line. If you stay long enough, you'll learn how people here tell weather as if it were gossip. Less harm in calling it that. Do they talk to the building too? I asked. They talk to each other about not talking to it, she said dryly. It's a method. She looked up at me then, a long look that made me set my hands on the counter like someone preparing to receive instruction. There's something you'll want to understand before tonight, she said. Every time it hears itself, it asks us a different question. We practice not answering the question it asks. We answer a different one. That's how we keep our own houses. What questions does it ask? I asked, knowing I wouldn't be told. Old ones, she said, the kind that make you name who you are and what you'd pay to keep from changing. Do not say your name out loud when it's ringing. Don't say anyone else's either. It's greedy with names. If you must speak, talk about your kettle and your bread and the way you like your socks folded. Or better, don't speak at all. Let your clock speak for you. She pushed the net aside and came around the counter with slow deliberation as if she were bringing weather with her. She put something small and cold in my palm, a brass token stamped with a circle and a line through it. Hold this when you don't know what the day is. It was made to refuse. It used to mean closed or done for now. It still remembers. Some metal keeps its meaning even when people forget. I closed my fingers around it. It fit too well, like a coin from a country I had visited without knowing. Thank you, I said, and meant it as a promise, the only kind of thanks that matters. The afternoon slid over the town like a hand smoothing a sheet. The sky gathered itself along the horizon and turned the color of a bruise, deciding what story to tell. I ate bread and a piece of white fish that had been a fish a few hours ago. I drank tea because tea is a habit you can put around things you don't understand. Upstairs, the clock sounded glad to see me, which is a sentence that would have made no sense to me a week ago. I wound it and felt the spring accept the turn, like a favor granted. The hands remained where they had chosen to live, at the mutual agreement of midnight and noon. I sat with my back to the cabinet and listened to the building around me breathe. People coming home and then being home. Chairs finding the angle they like. Pipes remembering to be pipes. Somewhere a radio tried on 3 different songs and kept none. The light conspired with the brass and the cream walls to lay a calm over the bed that I almost trusted. Almost is enough, sometimes if you've planned for the part of the night that isn't. The first bell came earlier than before, a little impatient, as if it had been ready and we had kept it waiting. It found me sitting straight, hands on my thighs, coin in my palm, breath counting itself. The tick folded itself around the note, like a hand around a candle. The second bell had weight, the weight of ritual, and it disturbed nothing because everything had already made space for it. The third did not come for a long time. I felt it moving through the town in the length of the pause. Windows narrowed, eyes closed with intention, mouths made the shape of words, and then did not let sound follow. When it finally arrived, the third note contained a question, the way a tide contains the moon. I could not hear the words, but I could feel the shape they wanted my mouth to make. You? It asked, but not in English, not in any language, just in that old way some places ask you to stand where you are and be counted. It asked for my name, for the one the town used, and the one I used alone. I kept my mouth closed and let the clock say it for me. Tick I am, tick I am, tick I am. I held the coin and felt its refusal steady, the edges of my hand. The room seemed to lean, not toward the bell but toward me, as if deciding whether I understood what I owed it. I put my feet flat on the floor and remembered the ledger's line, neither is free, but one lets us count our own houses. I counted. 1 house, mine, a bed, a cabinet, a clock that liked company, a window that looked at water and did not ask for anything back, a landlady who told me the difference between quiet and sleep. The counting happened without numbers. It happened in objects and breath. The fourth bell came from farther away, small and almost shy, like a child deciding to join a game. The fifth followed fast and sounded like it had been rung with hands that did not know their own strength. The sixth and seventh were rumors, the kind of sounds you get when memory tries to ring. The eighth came from the brick building, even though I wasn't there. I knew it because my teeth understood the distance. The ninth did not ring at all. Something else did. A sound between wood and water, between rope and throat. It filled the space in me that fear usually finds. The coin cooled again. I stayed where I was and let my lungs make a pattern that the room could learn. The 10th bell asked a smaller question. I answered with the room. The 11th did not ask anything. It only reminded me that questions could be asked forever. The 12th happened in my bones. After, the rain didn't come. The silence did. It was not the politeness of a town going to bed. It was the hush of a building, remembering its history aloud. and then deciding to be quiet for your sake. I slept then, not because I had earned it, but because I had been given it for a while. The dream that followed was neither the hall, nor the wall, nor the sea. It was a kitchen, not mine, not the landlady's. The table was scrubbed bare and waited for hands. A kettle sat on a stove that knew how to be useful. In the corner, a child's shoes waited, toes pointing at each other in conspiratorial talk. The ship's clock hung above the door, and its hands did not move, but its tick could be felt in the way steam lifted. The door opened, and a girl came in with rope burns on her palms and ink on her wrist. She looked at me with the plain gravity of someone who has seen the sea argue with itself and win twice. When it asks, she said, ask it back. She set a small brass coin on the table and slid it across as if paying for bread. Your house, she added, and I woke with my hand already closed. At dawn, the town had the restful guilt of a place that has managed to get away with something. The landlady's cardigan looked less tired. The man in the cap walked by the window and tipped 2 fingers to the glass without seeing me. I wanted eggs and got them, scrambled into submission, piled next to bread that sang when you broke it. Between bites, I told the landlady I had been polite. She accepted the report with a nod that understood there had been temptations and that I had done what I could. You'll go back to the hall today, she said, neutral as a forecast. It will be different. It always is after it's rung. Should I asked. Wanting and shoulding are different maps, she said. If you go, don't take your questions where the pictures can see them. Look at the floor. Floors know things without getting proud about it. I went because I did. The lane seemed shorter, the doorway taller. The air in the hall had been washed and hung to dry. The rope looked ordinary, and that more than anything made me wary. Benches had gathered a skin of dust again, enough to make me think a night had passed in which the room had been alone. The chalkboard ghost had decided to be bolder. I could now read a word I could not make sense of. Keep, not keep out, not keep off. Just keep, as if the sentence had been waiting to finish itself. The cabinet stood where I had left it. The ledger, when I opened it, had turned its own page. Newer entries. Strange, because newer here meant perhaps a generation ago. The hand that had written the secret lines had grown more confident, more sparing. She had begun to put questions into her notes, not just answers. What do we owe the bell? Why does it ask when it knows? What does it keep when we don't answer? Some entries were short, almost empty, as if she'd been called away mid-thought. Once she had written a date, and nothing else, and the date was the day the plaque at the lighthouse house had told me was an ending. I closed the book because my throat hurt. I found a bench with a view of nothing but floor, and sat with the posture of someone who is practicing not to cry. The rope lifted in my peripheral vision by the thickness of a breath, and settled again, as if a hand had changed its mind about touching it. Ask it back, the girl in the dream had said. I could say nothing tonight, and that would be good. Or I could say something that belonged to me. I could ask the bell a question it didn't want, and maybe that would be a way to keep my house. Footsteps in the doorway announced the cap before his voice did. Learn something, he said. It wasn't a guess or an accusation. It was a fact about a person in a room. I think so, I said. I don't know how to use it. You don't use it, he said. You live with it. He came to the bench and sat one person away, which is the correct distance for conversations in rooms that listen. The building will take your answers. It cannot bear your questions. That's the joke we make to keep ourselves from thinking too long. But there's a truth in it. Ask it something it can't ring. Ask it what it owes us. Ask it what it keeps when we don't speak. Ask it how many houses it knows by heart. He tilted his chin at the rope. It doesn't like arithmetic. Will that make it go quiet? I asked. It will make it be what it is, he said, and that is enough. You can sleep in a town that knows what it is. We sat like that long enough for the room to mistake us for furniture. When he left, He took some of the room's attention with him, and I loved him for that small theft. I stood and walked to the threshold and looked at the town, which was doing its best to be ordinary and mostly succeeding. I went back to the chandlery and bought a length of cord I didn't need. The landlady cut it and handed me the extra piece as a tip, which is how small places tell you they've decided you can belong a little. Afternoon slowed to the hour when curtains consider closing and decide it's too soon. I ate early out of a superstition I refused to admit was superstition. I wound the clock and thanked it out loud because gratitude is not always a trap if you mean it for the right thing. I sat with the coin in my palm and my feet on the floor and my questions lined up like good china. The sky blued itself into indifference. The first bell arrived with precision. It sounded less like a demand and more like a default. The second was gentle, which unsettled me more than iron. The third took its time coiling through the town. When it got to me, I was ready. When the shape of my name tried to form on my tongue, I held the coin and asked the room back, with no voice, only the terrible impatience of thought. What do you keep when we do not answer? The question did not make a sound. It made a shape that leaned outward instead of in. The fourth bell stumbled over it. The fifth went around. The sixth arrived late, as if it had gone to ask permission. I asked again, how many houses do you know by heart? The clock delighted in this. It ticked with a little pride, as if I had offered it a toy and it had learned a new trick. The seventh bell sounded different to me, hollow in a way that might have been relief. The eighth was proud, and then ashamed of being proud. The ninth and 10th tried to harmonize, and couldn't, like siblings caught telling different versions of the same story. The 11th let the rain into its throat. The 12th happened where it always does now, somewhere that can't be seen. The quiet that followed had a different density. It did not thicken to a warning. It lay down like a dog under the table and went to sleep. I breathed and remembered to breathe, and then didn't have to remember. The coin cooled. The clock kept me. Something under the floorboards ticked again, and I realized it wasn't a clock at all, but the building's own habit of being alive. The habit relaxed. Mine did too. I slept in large pieces that fitted together when I woke. Morning came with the sound of a cart and someone laughing at the idea of weather having a plan. The landlady's face looked like a sky that had made up with the wind. She put jam on the counter and didn't ask me anything she already knew. I told her anyway. She listened until I was done and then wiped a small spill with the corner of her apron, an act that always feels like a benediction. You'll be wanting to leave soon, she said, as if this were the natural consequence of a night well managed. Soon, I said, feeling it, not a rejection. A season ending. One more sleep, I added, and she nodded. Best to go on an odd number, she said. Even numbers pretend to be finished and then surprise you. The day behaved. The hall pretended I didn't exist, and I returned the courtesy. I walked the seawall, and the dog approved of my choices. The boarded house by the lighthouse was the same, and not the same. How could it be? Its shutters set like eyelids in a dream where they have decided to stay closed. I touched the small brass plaque at the gate, and the metal was warmer than the air. I said aloud, to the kind of listening that doesn't eat nouns, I am keeping my own house, and the wind agreed not to make that into anything else. Evening sat on the roofs in the way that tells you it will not get up again until it wants to. I went upstairs early and opened the window a fraction so the sea could keep me honest. I wound the clock and set the key down and counted the ticks until I could not separate one from another. When the bells came, if they came, I planned to let them ring to themselves and ask them nothing and answer them less. Not defiance, fatigue, the good kind. I must have slept before the first note, because the thing that woke me was not iron but cloth, the soft rubbing of rope in a high room, far away and as intimate as a whisper from the next pillow. I lay still. and knew the hall had decided to ring to itself without asking for an audience. A blessing then disguised as omission. The second sound was water not moving. The third was my clock reminding my bones. I let the night go where it wanted to go. When the rain finally came, it came in soft handfuls, like someone rinsing their hair under an old tap. I slept all the way through the hour and woke in the light with no shape of a question in my mouth. In the morning, the town's faces said goodbye in their own alphabet. A nod, a coil thrown more neatly than needed, a loaf set a little heavier in its paper, a dog showing me its side instead of its teeth. The landlady wrapped the brass coin in brown paper as if it were a pastry and pressed it into my hand with an expression that forbade refusal. "You can post it back when you're sure," she said, "or keep it and be sure that way. I'll pay for it," I began, and she flicked a look at me so swift and dry it burned. "You will not," she said. "You'll keep it or you'll return it, or you'll forget you ever had it and find it when you need it. That's the cost." She reached behind the counter and produced a folded sheet, a rubbing someone had taken from a plaque years ago. The letters came through like ghosts asserting themselves. She slid it into my bag. "In case your house needs to remember another house," she said. I walked down to the seawall one last time because ritual steals the teeth from endings. The water was unambitious, and so was the sky. The brick building was what it is. The hall would ring again when it wanted to, and the town would be polite until it had a reason not to be. I stood there with my hands in my pockets and let myself be small and human and temporary, and kept. When I turned back inland, the lane took me like it always had, narrow, damp smelling, ivy telling the same story in different leaves. The clock upstairs would tick until someone loved it, and then it would tick again. I had one more night before the bus, and the city, and the louder kinds of bells. I didn't dread them. I had a rule in my pocket, and another in my chest. And as I passed the tall doorway for the last time that day, I looked straight ahead and asked it in my head, for the sake of truth and practice both, "What do you owe us?" The building did not answer because buildings don't. The wind did, a little, and the ropes at the harbor and something under the floorboards went on living, and that was the only answer I needed to carry through one more sleep. The last morning began with a sky so pale it seemed embarrassed by itself. The gulls were slow to argue, the water slow to rise. I woke before the landlady knocked, before the clock had a chance to remind me, and lay in bed listening to a room that had learned to know me. The brass face glowed faintly in the dim light, its hands still and sure. At 12 and 12, I wound it one final time, not out of duty, but gratitude, the way you pat a dog's head before leaving, knowing the dog will forgive you. The key turned smooth, like it had been waiting for this last winding. Downstairs, the landlady had already set the kettle to fuss. "Odd numbers are the best," she said, handing me toast dark enough to count as bread's other self. 3 nights, 5 nights, 7. You'll leave on 5. That's proper. "I thought I'd only come for quiet," I said. "I didn't expect to come for rules." "That's what quiet is," she answered, spreading butter with small decisive strokes. "Just rules nobody's written down yet." I walked the lanes as if saying goodbye in syllables. The boarded lighthouse house stood with its patience. The plaque gleamed dully. I touched it again, and this time said nothing, not even in my head. The brick building kept its doorway tall, and its lintel unreadable. I walked past without slowing, but the corner of my eye remembered the rope, and the ledger, and the girl in the dream. My hand closed around the coin in my pocket, the brass cool and persuasive. The bus would not come until the following dawn. One last night. The town carried itself through the day, as though pretending storms had been invented elsewhere. Nets dried, children quarreled, men mended, women stood indoors and spoke to weather like an old friend. The landlady hummed tunelessly while brushing down the counter. I tried to write again, but the paper resisted words. All I could manage were sketches, the angle of the rope, the way the light from the high window fell like a blade, the look in the cabman's eyes when he told me not to name things aloud. Evening came as if rehearsed. I ate bread and cheese, poured tea, and set the cup beside the clock. The sea muttered softly beyond the walls. A wind gathered itself along the horizon. I opened the window a fraction, enough for the salt to come in, and sat on the bed with the coin in my palm. The first bell rang at twilight, when the gulls were deciding whether to shut up for the night. It was quieter than before, but clearer, like a voice that had given up pretending to be polite. The town hushed around it. I felt the stillness settle into the walls, into my bones. The second bell came slower, deliberate, savoring its place in the air. My mouth wanted to answer with a name. I pressed the coin harder into my palm. The clock ticked gently, kindly. The third bell did not come. Instead, a new sound, rope creaking, high and distant, like the hall had decided to ring without iron, to let hempen air carry its question. The sound spread until the whole room seemed woven with it. The walls leaned closer. The ledger's words returned to me. Neither is free, but one lets us count our own houses. I tried to count. Bed, cabinet, clock, window, bread crust left on the desk, landlady humming below. My body still mine. Then the rope's sound changed. It became a voice, not quite male, not quite female, but old, as if time itself had decided to ask. The words did not belong to language, yet I understood. What will you give me? I almost said nothing. I almost said everything. Instead, I remembered the dream girl's command, ask it back. So I asked silently, fiercely, what do you give me? The rope hushed, as if taken aback. The storm paused outside. The silence thickened until I thought it would press my chest flat. The fourth bell struck then, louder than any before, but cracked, flawed, as if it had split against my question. The fifth and sixth followed quickly, almost panicked. The seventh came late, dragging itself. The eighth did not come at all. The ninth rose inside my own head, a whisper like a tide pulling at my thoughts. I pushed it away with the coin, with the clock's tick, with my stubborn insistence on the small toast, tea, the landlady's cardigan, the way the dog wagged its tail on the wall. The 10th bell asked nothing. The 11th rang like laughter heard through walls. The 12th came in the bones of the building, in the floorboards, in the very air. Then all was quiet again. I sat unmoving for a long time, afraid to breathe, afraid not to. At last I whispered aloud, breaking my own rule. I am keeping my house. The words were small, but they steadied me. The rope fell silent. The hall, wherever it was in the night, let me go. Sleep came in heavy pieces. My dream was of the kitchen again, the kettle steaming, the shoes in the corner. The girl sat at the table, older now, her eyes weary but proud. You asked, she said, and you will keep asking. That's enough. Leave while you can, and don't look back more than twice. She slid the coin across the table. It was the same coin I held in my dream hand. I woke with it still warm in my real one. The last dawn came bright and cold. The town bustled like nothing had happened, like nothing ever did. People nodded, children laughed, gulls argued, nets mended. Ordinary life, layered over the extraordinary, as carefully as cloth over a clock. I carried my duffel down the stairs, the landlady waiting with a parcel of bread and cheese wrapped in wax paper. You'll go now, she said. 5 nights. That's proper. Thank you, I said, for everything. You'll remember to count, she replied. That's all I ask. Outside, the bus idled, its paint dulled by salt, its windows clouded by sleep. I looked once toward the lighthouse house, its shutters shut against history, once toward the brick hall, its doorway tall and unrepentant, twice, just as the dream girl had said. Then I stepped onto the bus. The town slipped away, roofs shrinking, nets blurring. the sea a silver thread unraveling. I kept the coin in my pocket and the tick of the ship's clock in my memory. Behind me, the bells would ring again, questions asked and refused, houses kept and lost. Ahead of me, the city waited with its louder clocks and louder rules. But I carried mine now. I carried the habit of counting. I carried the silence that listens. And in that silence, I thought perhaps sleep will finally come when I ask it. Now, on to the next story. The job was simple, on paper, which is the way certain jobs like to be. Night digitization assistant, temporary contract, graveyard shift. Arrive at 9:45 p.m., sign the ledger, collect the key card and the card of file boxes, scan insurance documents from the 1950s that smelled faintly of smoke and winter, upload, verify, return to boxes to the cage, leave by 6:10 a.m., no client contact, no phone calls. Building security would be a single guard on the mezzanine. If I needed anything, there was a radio with a cracked antenna that only talked to the mezzanine in short, courteous bursts. The email ended. Please observe after-hours protocols. They're mostly about quiet. The building had a name the way old ships have names. Whittemore and Glass, 1928, carved over the door. Limestone softened by a century of weather and hands. It had not tried to be tall, but it had tried to be right. Brass, marble, blunted edges of stairs worn by shoes that knew how to be shoes. I stepped in, and the echo did that thing echoes do in good lobbies, announce you to the building in a voice kinder than your own. The guard on the mezzanine leaned over the rail like an usher. He had the face of a person who had learned to nap with his eyes open. A blue blazer hung from a hook behind him, dignified even off his shoulders. Night digitization, I said, raising one hand as if hailing a cab. First shift. Then you're early, he replied, checking a clipboard with a pencil that had been sharpened into stubbornness. That's the best way to arrive anywhere. Name? I gave it and watched him find it like a word in a prayer book. He nodded, satisfied, and pointed at a book the size of a pizza box sitting on the marble table below his perch. The cover was leather cracked into maps. A pen lay diagonally across it. Not modern, not antique, just permanent. Sign where it wants you, he said, which I disliked for reasons I couldn't name. Below that, practicalities. Keycards in the drawer. Third floor is archives. Backroom lights are on a timer. Scanner's temperamental. If it pretends to jam on the second pull, feed the page again upside down. Makes it think it won. I signed. The paper took the ink with a thirsty satisfaction, the way plants take rain. My name looked sensible there, as if it had been waiting for this particular calligraphy its whole life. The guard watched my hand, and then glanced at a clock that had been keeping time since laws wore hats. After-hours protocols are on the placard by the elevator, he said. They're simple. Follow them like you mean it. The placard was brass, etched shallowly, polished by generations of reading. After-hours protocols, it said, as if I'd wandered into a club for polite ghosts. 1. Do not use the west stairwell between midnight and 3 a.m. It tends to repeat itself. 2. If the elevator stops on 4 when you pressed 3, step out, step back in, and press 3 again. Do not look down the hall. 3. Radios are for check-ins at the top of the hour. If you hear your name at any other time, it is the mezzanine, and we are testing you. Do not answer until 0. 4. Reflections after 2 a.m. are none of our business. 5. At 5:40 a.m., return the boxes to the cage, sign out exactly as you signed in, and leave by the north doors. The south doors are for day people. I read it twice, felt the smile forming on my face, a small amused thing at someone's idea of atmosphere. The guard didn't return it. They're there because we learned them, he said, and in his voice a long line of knights turned their heads to listen. The elevator had a crank-era dignity and a retrofit of buttons that had decided to be honest. I pressed 3. It considered. It rose. On the way up, the world stepped away in increments, and I saw myself in the faint metal, tired, a little hopeful, the color of my coat faded by old sun. I looked away to be polite to the placard. The third-floor corridor smelled like paper that had learned how to keep its breath. Lights hummed magnesium white. The archive door had a grill inset like a polite prison. Inside, steel shelves marched neat as an army, labels written in block letters with numbers that told a story of their own. The scanner sat on a table near the only window tall enough to feel like a posture, its surface a square of glass that remembered every set of hands that had wiped it. A rolling chair leaned against the wall, judging nothing. The radio crackled on the cart. Mezzanine, the guard's voice said. Check at the hour. Welcome to Whitmore and Glass. Copy, I said, because language bends to the room it's in. He didn't answer. The clock on the wall, age indeterminate, second hand limping on purpose, said 9:52. I had time to breathe. I did. The first box was light with letters from 1951. Fire claims, winter claims, a water damage report written in a hand that would have made a doctor envious. I fed them to the scanner and learned its moods. Don't rush. Don't press too hard on the glass. Flatten gently with your palm like calming a nervous horse. Pages that had been folded for decades remembered how to be flat with a sigh. I named the files sensibly so that future me could find them. Date, claim, initials that had faded into time. At 10 exactly, I pressed the radio's button. Third floor, I said, working. All well. Mezzanine, the guard replied. Heard. The building went about its gentle night chores. Air cycled. Ducks thought quietly. Far below, something heavy moved the way furniture moves when it tries to sit down without bothering anyone. I fell into a rhythm that belonged more to the room than to me. Feed, align, scan, check, name, return. Every 10th page I stood and left my body in the chair for a breath, the way you do when the task is good, but your bones have had a day. After a while, no timekeeping needed, just body footsteps entered the corridor and walked the floor like someone testing an instrument. I didn't hear the elevator. The steps began at the far angle and came toward the archive door with a steadiness that made me set my palm on the scanner glass to keep from moving. They stopped beside the window. Through the grill, I saw a shoulder in a gray suit, the color of old money, no face. The steps did not belong to the building, the way the guards did. They belonged to the hour itself. They paused as if reading. The radio stayed quiet. I stayed quiet. The steps went on toward the west stairwell, and then, without sound to justify it, I knew they had turned around and climbed down the same landing twice. Protocol 1 was, apparently, not a joke. I worked. Work is a bridge you build between yourself and a place. At 11 third floor. Working. Mezzanine. Heard. At 11:37, the scanner took offense at a perforated form and pretended to jam. I humored it, fed the page upside down, and it decided to be helpful again, gratified by my willingness to let it win. At 11:50, I stood to stretch and saw my reflection in the window glass superimposed overnight. My face looked patient. The room behind me looked like a set that knew its lines. The second hand kept its limp. The radio stayed uninterested. Midnight had a weight in this building. You could feel it settle into the marble, like a coin dropping into a jar. At 12 I pressed the radio and said my piece. The mezzanine's answer had a blink of delay, as if he had been talking to someone just then and had needed to excuse himself. Heard, he said. Mind the west stairs. I'm not using the stairs, I said, because I had learned to narrate my own safety. Elevator's loyal. Good, he said, and the line clicked back into its house. At 12:20, I needed the restroom, which lived 2 doors down, past the framed photographs of men in hats who had been called vice president when that job meant keeping keys and not much else. I took the radio because it felt like the sort of talisman you don't leave behind. The hallway echoed the way hallways echo when they have high ceilings and a memory for heels. In the mirror over the sink, the fluorescent light softened enough to make my face forgive me. I washed my hands long enough to feel like I had reset a clock. When I stepped back into the corridor, the elevator doors were open, framed by their own careful brass. I hadn't pressed the button. The car waited, lit, that mild square of space with a scuffed threshold that says, "People." I stood where I was and let it wait. The doors did not mind. They hung open like a mouth prepared to tell a story, only if asked. I took one step forward, and the radio crackled once, not with voice but with that dry sound radios make when they are choosing their next word. "Third floor," I said into it, a little too quickly. "Bathroom break." Returning. "Mezzanine," the guard said. "Take your time. Don't rush the elevator." I began, and stopped. The elevator's light dimmed, and then brightened, as if it had blinked. I walked past it without stepping in, and felt something in the car's air consider me. Behind me, the doors closed without complaint. At 1, the check-in. At 1:14, the first real oddness. I pressed 3 on the elevator to return from a trip to the copy room, and the car took me to 4. The doors opened onto a hall with carpet, the color of a sleeping bruise, and lights that had decided to be soft. The placard's memory reached up and tapped my shoulder. "Step out, step back in, press 3 again. Do not look down the hall." I followed the rule like I meant it. The carpet tried to be a horizon in my peripheral vision. The air smelled like flowers had been asked to behave. I did not look. Back in, button, 3. The car corrected itself like a well-trained animal and took me where I belonged. At 1:30, a page with a single line in pencil made me sit longer than I needed to. "Keep receipt if it burns twice." It was nothing, just a secretary's quick note from a day someone's office stank of singed dust. But the words accumulated weight in my mind, the way certain phrases do in certain rooms. "Burns twice." I put the page to the glass and gave it the flattery of a good scan, as if respect could move backward in time. At 1:58, I realized I had been humming. I don't hum. The tune sloped up and down like a stair that turned on itself. I stopped. The radio woke itself. "Mezzanine," the guard said before I could press the button. 2 minutes. "I'm here," I said, and suddenly needed that to be true in more than one way. At 2:00, the radio clicked and the check-in was simple. At 2:06, the window glass decided to remember it was a mirror, and for a moment I saw the room behind me, not as it was, but as it wanted to be in a different year. The chair newer, the table darker, a fan in the corner pretending to make a difference. In that reflection, the door to the archive was closed. I felt my own hand reach up and rub my jaw, and in the glass the reflected hand did not. It took a breath and put itself down. I looked away because Protocol 4 was clear, and because I wanted the rule more than I wanted information. At 2:21, footsteps again, the same steady measure, the same kindness to the floor. They went past toward the west stairs. I counted them against the clock to test something. They reached the landing at 2:23, and then reached it again at 2:24. The rhythm was exact, the repetition patient, like someone reciting a poem to remember a dead person's middle name. I pressed my lips together and held very still until the poem ended. At 2:40, I opened a file that didn't belong in the box. Wrong year, wrong department. A small folder labeled Night Ledger, borrowed. Inside, a thin notebook bound in red cloth. Not the big book downstairs, a cousin, a pocket version. The pages were nearly empty. In neat, tired handwriting, a list. If the elevator breathes, you breathe slower. If the west stair repeats, count steps and do not correct. If the radio says your name after the hour, Tell it about weather with no nouns. Do not let your reflection start the conversation. At 3:15, go get coffee. Bring a second cup. Put it on the table by the door. Return the cup to the sink at 4 on the dot. Dry it. Leave no proof of wet. There was a blot beneath the last line, a small drowned star. I looked at the scanner, at the clock, at the door. At 3:10, I found a clean ceramic mug in the cabinets under the sink, chalk white with a hairline crack that made it more honest. I poured from the ancient carafe in the copy room. The smell rose and did what coffee does, made courage an option. At 3:15, because someone else had done this before me and left instructions, I poured a second cup and set it on the table by the door to the archive, where the grill looked like it could keep something in and let someone see out. The steam made a shape, and then another, and then decided to be air. Nobody came. The coffee sat. My own cup cooled and tasted like a story whose ending you already knew. At 3:59, with a small, embarrassed feeling I couldn't shake, I took the untouched cup to the sink and washed it. The crack in the glaze darkened and then dried pale again. I put it back where I'd found it. The instructions had not been for me, I told myself. They had been for the hour. At 4, the radio breathed. Not the guard, not a voice, the sound of a room thinking. I pressed the button and said calmly, the weather with no nouns. It will be. It has been. It is not. It pretends to. It would like to. It might if we let it. The sound stopped politely, as if satisfied with my grammar. At 4:20, the scanner refused a page that looked normal. It slid halfway, hesitated, slid back. I checked the rollers. Fine. I flipped the page. Same refusal. Third try, it took the paper and made an image that was all dark, as if I'd laid my palm to the glass. Fourth try, the text appeared in perfect gray, but the date in the corner was wrong by a year, 1950, instead of 1951. I saved it with the name it insisted on and told myself that nothing prefers to be exact all night long. At 5, wariness came down soft across my shoulders, like a coat offered by a kind stranger. The building felt warm by then, the way old spaces do, after you've been gentle with them. The mezzanine answered crisply at the hour, sounding for the first time like he'd had coffee and let it be coffee. Coming home time, he said. Mind the north doors. Copy, I said, as if the word could hold me upright for the last hour. Protocol 5 circled in my head, neat and final. Boxes to the cage. Sign out exactly as I signed in. North doors. The scanner was suddenly eager to please. Pages flew, names settled, digital files lined up in their folder like well-behaved schoolchildren. At 5:32, the elevator came when I asked and took me to 3 instead of 4. At 5:37, I rolled the cart to the cage at the end of the corridor and slid the boxes into their slots, numbers returning to numbers like fish to water. I closed the padlock and felt it take my decision. At 5:40, exactly, I stood at the ledger in the archive to make the last notes I kept for myself, and noticed that the red notebook I'd returned to the borrowed folder was missing. The folder sat where I'd left it. The notebook was not inside. I did not look for it, not because I am noble, but because I had learned the weight of looking after certain hours. At 5:45, I pressed 1, and the elevator took me down. The brass rail under my hand, warmer than metal, has a right to be. The lobby was the kind that makes you quiet because the air has earned it. On the marble table, the big ledger waited with its pen lying diagonal, exactly where it wanted me. I signed out in the line that had been waiting to be complete, a simple echo of my own hand from hours earlier. The ink looked satisfied. The guard watched me with the approval reserved for people who've taken instruction well. First night's the whole degree, he said, and picked up his pencil. The rest is practicum. I read the placard, I said. They're not jokes. No, he said, they're manners. He looked past me to the south doors, glass darker than it should be. as if the night had left part of itself there. North, he reminded, day folks can have the south. I turned to go and remembered the coffee. I didn't say anything. He didn't either. The morning outside had the brittle light of a new habit. I stepped into it and felt taller, not because I'd done anything brave, but because I had been precise in a building that demanded precision. On the sidewalk, buses yawned, and people began practicing their faces for the day. I breathed in the air that hadn't been filtered in 100 years, and thought absurdly of the instruction about the cup. I would come back the next night and bring two again. It wasn't superstition. It was a way to be courteous to an hour. At home, I slept in a way that didn't feel like quitting. When I woke, the city had already put on its noise. My phone had 3 messages I didn't listen to. I made tea because coffee belonged to the building in my mind. By early evening, I found myself looking forward to the elevator's small consideration, the scanner's moods, the mezzanine's brief acknowledgments that felt like finding a neighbor in a big place. The job was simple. The rules were simpler. I wanted the simplicity like you want a clean page. That second night, the ledger wanted me 2 lines down from where I'd signed before. I didn't argue. The guard nodded as if that had been a test I'd passed. Storm later, he said, glancing at the clock. If the radio talks during the storm, let it finish. Weather likes to hear itself. I won't answer, I said, and the words felt like buckling a belt. Answer at the hour, he said. Tell me something boring. Like what? Like the number of boxes, he said, and smiled. It makes the building jealous. The elevator blinked at me in a friendly way. On 3, the corridor smelled of warm dust. I set my things down, greeted the room in my head because sometimes that helps, and began to work. At 10, I told the radio there were 12 boxes on the cart. The mezzanine said, heard, and the shelf across from me creaked as if it would have preferred a different number. At 11, I said there were 11. At midnight, 10. I was lying to the building courteously, giving it something to want without giving it anything it could take. At 12:40, the west stair repeated itself twice so neatly that it felt like a drum beat. At 1:05, my reflection asked me a question with its eyes, and I answered by closing mine. At 1:30, the red notebook was back in the folder, with a new line in the neat, tired hand. If you bring 2 cups at 3:15, leave one near the elevator, he prefers the hall. At 3:15, I left the second cup on the small table by the elevator bank, not in the car, because the rule didn't say in. Steam rose, and the brass trim reflected it like weather in miniature. I went back to work. At 3:59, I collected the cup, its surface marked with the faintest ring where a lip had been, though no lip had been there. I washed it without looking for proof. I dried it thoroughly. I put it back on the shelf where cups rest and pretend to be ordinary. At 4:40, the building gently, a big cat turning over in sleep. The radio spoke my name in a voice that sounded like the mezzanine and a room in rain braided. I told it the number of boxes. It went quiet, satisfied with arithmetic. At 5:40, I closed up exactly as before. At the ledger downstairs, my hand hesitated, just once, because the line that wanted me was not the next one, but the one below it, and I realized the book was keeping time with me, not the other way around. I signed where it wanted. The guard's pencil paused over his crossword. You'll do, he said. 3 nights is knowing, 5 is belonging. If you leave before 5, bring a receipt, even if it burns twice. I nodded as if that were a thing people said. Outside, morning had set the table again, and I went home to sleep, counting my breaths the way a kind building likes, steady and exact, keeping the small rules that let bigger things leave you alone. The third night greeted me like an old habit. The bus ride blurred by in pieces of streetlight, and I stepped onto the Whittemore and glass sidewalk before the hour had fully darkened. The limestone looked softer than it had the first night, as if the building had decided to trust me with more of its weight. The guard on the mezzanine barely glanced up. He seemed to know my footsteps now. His blazer hung on the hook, the same dignified tilt, as if it had always belonged to the wall. "Ledger?" he said, pencil in hand, voice steadier than the night outside. The book waited open on the marble table. The line below my last entry was already thirsty. Paper grain angled toward my pen. I signed where it wanted. The ink darkened in an instant, obedient. The guard's pencil scratched across his crossword, a sound of mild approval. "Storm cleared," he said. "The building will try something quieter tonight. That's when people make mistakes." "Quieter is harder," I admitted. "Always," he said, not unkindly. "Noise tells on itself. Quiet waits for you to tell on yourself." I pocketed the keycard and pressed the elevator's brass button. The car came promptly. No hesitation, no tricks. The placard by the door had begun to shine in my memory without needing to look. West stairs between midnight and 3. 4th floor. Radios at the hour. Reflections not your business. North doors only. Rules as clear as prayers, as sharp as warnings. I repeated them under my breath as the elevator lifted me. On 3, the corridor breathed paper and warm dust. The archive door recognized me with a sigh in its hinges. I set the boxes on the table and greeted the scanner like an old colleague. My reflection in its glass was faint, almost polite, as if it had been taught manners by the guard himself. The radio crackled once, then stilled, saving its first word for the hour. I worked. Work was becoming easier, my hands knowing the scanner's moods, my body remembering when to stand, when to stretch. Letters from the late 1940s, typed on onion skin paper that still held the crisp scent of carbon. Claims for floods, for broken windows, for the kind of accidents that sound small in retelling but are disasters in the moment. Each page flattened under my palm, scanned into permanence, set back into the box with the respect you give bones. At 10, I pressed the button. 3rd floor. Working. All well. Mezzanine. Heard. The guard's voice was steady. His words clipped, as though the hour had no room for ornament. The building hummed. I could almost feel the ducks exhaling behind the walls. Somewhere below, a door shifted in its frame, a soft click like punctuation. I fed pages, named files, lined them in their folders. My thoughts thinned until only the work and the clock remained. Tick, scan, save. Tick, scan, save. The rhythm became its own answer. At 10:37, the west stair creaked, once, though no one should have been using it. I paused, my fingers on the paper, listening. The sound came again, fainter, like an echo stretched too far. Protocol 1 echoed in my mind. Do not use between midnight and 3. It tends to repeat itself. It was early yet, but maybe the stairs were rehearsing. I turned back to the scanner, keeping my eyes fixed on the glass. At 11, the radio clicked. 3rd floor, I said. 2 boxes down. Mezzanine. Heard. Count them again. I counted aloud into the radio. 10 remaining. Good, he said. The building wanted a different number. The line went quiet. My skin prickled. I looked at the boxes, counted them silently. 10. They hadn't moved, but for one instant, I thought I could see their shadows stacked a little differently, taller, as if a hand had touched them when I wasn't watching. I wrote the number in my notebook, a small defense against doubt. At 11:20, footsteps, not the measured kind I'd heard before, but light, quick, like someone pacing to keep awake. They stopped outside the door. The grill framed nothing but shadow, but I felt watched. A whisper followed, not words, but the shape of breath forming in tension. My throat tightened. The rules repeated in my mind. Radios at the hour, not before. I didn't move. The whisper lengthened, testing the silence, and then withdrew, footsteps fading toward the stairwell. I exhaled only when the building exhaled with me. At 11:55, I stood stretching. The window glass was black with night, my reflection blurred across it, my face pale, my hair pulled back. I avoided my eyes, remembering Protocol 4, but in the glass my reflection's hand lifted when mine did not. It tapped the sill 3 times like a code. I froze. My real hand remained still at my side. The reflection smiled faintly, then vanished into the black. I stepped back, breath shaking, and turned to the radio, waiting for the hour. At 12, third floor, working, boxes accounted, mezzanine, heard, the guard said, though his voice carried a rasp as if he'd been running. Don't look at the glass tonight. I didn't, I said. That's why you're still answering. His tone made no room for misunderstanding. The storm of the night before had gone, but the quiet was sharper, more insistent. I scanned pages, forcing my eyes to the text, my ears to the radio's silence. Every tick of the clock felt like a test. At 12:40, the elevator chimed softly in the hall. Though I hadn't pressed the button, the doors opened with a sigh. I stayed at my table, pulse quick. The air shifted, like the car had exhaled a breath it had held too long. Then the doors closed, slow and disappointed. I let the silence rebuild itself. At one seft of the radio, third floor, I said, 7 boxes remaining. Mezzanine, heard. Weather? Clear, I said. Not for long, he answered, and the radio clicked out. At 1:14, the scanner stopped. Its screen flickered, black, then pale green. Lines of text scrolled where the claim form should have been. The words were mine, my own notes, my handwriting digitized, though I had not written them. They read, keep receipt if it burns twice, return coin when the day wants it. Ask it back. The screen went black. My hands trembled as I pulled the page, scanned again, and this time it behaved. I saved the file quickly, as though speed could undo what I had seen. At 1:30, the red notebook appeared again in the wrong folder. Its page had gained another line. If you hear your name before the hour, say the number of breaths you've taken. Nothing else. I copied the instruction into my notebook and returned the red one to its place, though I knew it would not stay. At 1:55, the radio hissed. My name, spoken slowly, like someone tasting it for the first time. My chest tightened. I counted my breaths, steady, deliberate. 132, I said. The hiss faded. The radio was silent until the hour, when the guard's voice returned, calm and ordinary. Third floor? Working. 6 boxes left. Heard, he said. His tone carried no hint that anything had happened. At 2:10, the west stair began again, this time louder, heavier, like boots. They reached the landing, paused, then repeated, over and over, as if the stairwell itself had grown bored and decided to loop a memory. I pressed my hands to my knees, holding still. The sound grew louder, closer, until I felt the vibration in the floor. Then it stopped. The silence afterward was worse than the sound. I counted the boxes again, just to hear my own voice. At 2:30, the reflection returned, not in the window, but in the scanner glass. My face upside down, staring at me with eyes that didn't blink. I closed the lid gently, covering it. The scanner hummed like a throat clearing, then quieted. I pressed the radio at the hour and forced my voice to be steady. Third floor, 4 boxes left. Heard, the guard said. His voice sounded tired, but alive. At 3 pain, my body ached with weariness. I made coffee in the copy room, poured 2 cups, set one on the table by the elevator, as the red notebook had instructed. Steam curled. I sipped mine and felt the warmth reach my bones. At 3:15, the cup by the elevator had cooled, the surface rippling faintly, as though someone had just set it down. I carried it back, washed it, dried it. No proof remained, but the crack in the glaze was deeper now, almost a second mouth. I put it back and returned to my chair, throat dry. At 3:30, the scanner took a page and gave me an image of a corridor. Not mine, not this building's. Long, dim, lined with doors. At the end, a shadow turned. I deleted it, scanned again. The claim form appeared, ordinary. I saved it quickly and didn't look at the file again. At 4, the radio. 3rd floor, 2 boxes left. Heard, don't answer any knocks, the guard said. That's not a protocol, that's just advice. At 4:20, 3 soft knocks came at the archive door. Not insistent, courteous. My name whispered. Low. I held my breath. The knocks came again, slower. I pressed the coin in my pocket, though I hadn't meant to bring it. It warmed under my fingers. The silence returned. I exhaled only when the clock ticked louder, reclaiming the room. At 5, the last pages scanned, the files saved. I stacked the boxes neatly, rolled the cart to the cage, and locked it. The padlock clicked shut with satisfaction. At 5:40, I stood before the ledger again. My hand hesitated. The line it wanted was 2 spaces down. I signed there. The ink bloomed like a bruise. The guard watched me from above, pencil idle. 3 nights is knowing, he said. 5 is belonging. You're at knowing now. The next 2 will decide which way it goes. I nodded, though my throat felt thick. And after 5, the building remembers you, he said. It doesn't forget. The doors opened. The morning light poured in, pale and forgiving. I stepped outside, the rules circling in my head, and thought of the notebook's line, ask it back. I wondered if I had the courage. The 4th night began, before I even reached the doors. I knew it because the air outside Whittemore and Glass felt different, as though the building had unbuttoned part of itself to see if I'd notice. The limestone glowed faintly under streetlight, less a surface than a face waiting for recognition. The guard on the mezzanine raised his eyes when I stepped inside. His pencil hovered over the crossword, but hadn't committed to a word. Ledger, he said, though his tone carried weight tonight, heavier than the first 3 nights. The book waited for me on the marble table, its cover open, pen resting diagonal like a compass needle that already knew my direction. I placed my name 2 lines down from where I thought I should, and the page accepted it without protest. The ink shimmered faintly in the lobby light, as if the paper were rehearsing its own echo. The guard studied me for longer than usual. 4 nights, he said. That's a threshold. If you cross it polite, you might find belonging. If you cross it careless, you'll find something else. What's on the other side? I asked, though my voice cracked. He shook his head, not refusing to answer, but letting me know the question wasn't mine to ask yet. North doors, don't forget, he said. And if the radio tells you something about yourself you didn't know, don't argue, just nod. I didn't like that rule. He didn't care if I liked it. The elevator came quickly, its doors opening like an old friend deciding to be kind. On the ride up, I watched my reflection faint in the metal walls, not sharp enough to catch my eyes, but enough to remind me I had them. I pressed 3. The car rose without hesitation. The corridor smelled sharper tonight, less paper, more ozone, like the aftermath of a photocopier running too hot. The archive door greeted me with its usual reluctant sigh. Inside, the boxes stood ready, stacked in the neatness of waiting. The scanner hummed, glass cool under my palm. The radio clicked once, acknowledging me without words, then fell silent until the hour. I began with insurance claims from 1947, thin sheets typed by hands long gone. The words felt brittle in my fingers, brittle in the way memories sometimes are, capable of snapping if handled wrong. I fed them to the scanner, flattened the folds gently, saved each digital echo into its folder. At 10i, I pressed the radio. 3rd floor, working, 10 boxes remaining. The guard's voice came steady. Mezzanine, heard. You sound tired. Drink water. I obeyed, pouring a glass from the jug in the corner. The water tasted faintly metallic, as if the pipes remembered storms. At 10:30, I glanced at the window. It was dark, reflecting me dimly. My reflection seemed normal at first, but when I lifted my hand to rub my neck, it didn't follow. Instead, it wrote something in condensation across the glass, though I hadn't breathed near it. One word, ask. My stomach nodded. Protocol 4 whispered, reflections after 2 a.m. are none of our business. But it wasn't 2 yet. Was this the building bending the rules, or was I? I turned away and buried myself in work. At 11 the radio clicked. Third floor, 9 boxes left, I said. Mezzanine. Heard. Boxes are listening. His words unsettled me. I counted them aloud anyway. 1, 2, 3. The sound of my own voice reassured me, though the shadows near the stack shifted faintly, as if the boxes adjusted themselves when unobserved. At 11:15, the west stair repeated itself, faint but insistent, step after step, then again, like a skipping record. I stayed at my table, hands steady on the scanner. The sound ceased abruptly, replaced by a whisper that pressed through the grill in the door. My name, drawn out like a rope being pulled. I remembered the red notebook's instruction. If you hear your name before the hour, count your breaths. 150, I whispered. The sound faded, leaving only the hum of the lights. At 11:30, the scanner refused a page. Instead of an image, the screen filled with text I hadn't written. The handwriting looked like mine, but older, as if aged by years I hadn't lived yet. The words read, "Don't answer with silence. Silence is still an answer. Ask it back." The letters pulsed faintly on the screen, then vanished. I scanned again. The page appeared normal. I saved it quickly, but my fingers trembled. At 11:55, I prepared for the check-in, nervous. The radio hissed. My name again, softer this time, coaxing. I pressed the button and said firmly, 200 breaths. The hiss stopped. At the hour, the guard's voice arrived, steady but weary. Third floor, 8 boxes left. Heard, he said, then paused. Don't let it charm you. Charm is a hunger with good posture. Midnight settled differently tonight. The silence had edges. I scanned page after page, forcing rhythm into my bones. The tick of the clock became a lifeline. At 12:20, the elevator chimed in the hall. The doors opened. I didn't press the button. The car waited, empty, its light too bright for the corridor. I ignored it, pressing the radio instead. Third floor, elevator opened. Mezzanine. Heard. Let it close itself. It did, reluctantly, as if disappointed in me. At 12:40, the window reflection returned. This time it didn't mimic me at all. It simply stared, its eyes darker than mine, its mouth set in a question I couldn't hear. I turned my chair so the window was behind me. The reflection could have all the staring it wanted. At 1 the radio. Third floor. 6 boxes remaining. Heard, the guard said. His voice wavered, as if the building had leaned too close to his perch. At 1:15, the scanner displayed not text but a photograph, black and white, grainy, of the very room I sat in, but emptier, with wooden tables instead of steel. In the center of the image, a woman sat at a desk. Her face was pale, hair tied back, eyes fixed on something outside the frame. Her hands rested on a red notebook. I blinked. The image vanished. The page scanned normally. I saved it, my pulse hammering. At 1:30, I checked the box labeled Night Ledger Borrowed. The red notebook was inside. I opened it carefully. A new line had appeared. At 1:45, open the ledger downstairs. It will already be open for you. Sign nothing, only look. My throat tightened. I shouldn't. Protocol said nothing about leaving my floor. Yet the note pulsed in my mind like a heartbeat. At 1:40, I hesitated at the archive door, radio in hand. The corridor stretched long, lights buzzing. I pressed the button, third floor, leaving to check something. Silence. Then the guard's voice. You'll find it open. Don't linger. My legs carried me to the elevator. The ride down was long, as though the building had stretched itself. The lobby was dim, shadows deeper than before. The big ledger lay open on the marble table, pages spread wide. I approached slowly. Names filled the lines, neat and endless, in handwriting that shifted from decade to decade. Some names I recognized faintly, old city officials, businessmen whose portraits I'd seen in dusty hallways. And then I saw mine, written not once but twice. The first entry was from the first night. The second was from tonight. Below it, a third space waited, my name already half formed in faint gray, as though the book had started writing it for me. I stepped back quickly, breath sharp. The ink shimmered faintly in the dim light. I whispered without meaning to, "What do you keep when we don't answer?" The ledger pages rustled as if caught in wind, though the air was still. I turned and hurried back to the elevator, heart pounding. At 1:55, I returned to the archive, chest tight. The radio hissed my name again. I whispered, 280 breaths, and it stopped. At the hour, the guard's voice came calm. "Third floor? 5 boxes left." Heard. "You looked. Good. Looking is safer than signing." At 2:15, the west stair boomed louder, heavier, until the sound vibrated the walls. It repeated the landing 3 times before fading. The silence after was a vacuum. At 2:30, my reflection in the scanner glass smiled faintly, though my lips were pressed tight. It lifted its hand and pointed downward, toward the lobby. I shut the lid quickly, breath shallow. At 2:40, the scanner spit out another image, the ledger, open, with my name written a third time. I hadn't touched it. The ink was fresh. My stomach dropped. I saved the file under the name the machine insisted on, my name 11948. At 3 wall, 3rd floor, 3 boxes left. Heard, the guard said, his voice sharp. Finished tonight. Tomorrow belongs to it. At 3:15, I poured 2 cups of coffee, leaving one by the elevator as before. When I returned at 3:59, the cup was empty, dry, as if nothing had ever filled it. I washed it, dried it, put it back. At 4, the radio hissed once, then spoke. My name, followed by words I hadn't expected. "You belong here now." My chest clenched. Protocol said, "Do not argue." So I nodded, though the guard couldn't see. At 4:10, the scanner gave me one last trick, a file image of my own hand holding the brass coin from the coastal town, though I had left it at home. I stared, shaken, then saved it under the date the system assigned, 5:40. At 5 Sipwalk, I finished the last pages, locked the boxes in the cage. My hands shook as I pressed the elevator button. The ride down was smooth, the car patient. The ledger waited again on the marble table. My name now appeared 3 times, each darker than the last. The pen lay diagonally, daring me. I didn't touch it. The guard's eyes followed me from the mezzanine, pencil still. 4 nights, he said softly. You've crossed. Tomorrow decides if you keep your house, or if the building keeps it for you. I nodded, throat too tight to speak. I left by the north doors into the brittle light of morning. The city had begun to stir, buses yawning, people practicing faces for the day. But my thoughts remained behind, in the lobby, with the ledger that wrote my name before I did. The 5th night met me at the curb like a verdict. The limestone looked almost wet under the streetlights, as if the building had washed its face before seeing me. My feet knew the rhythm up the steps. Inside, the lobby held its breath politely. The guard on the mezzanine didn't speak for a moment, pencil hovering, blazer a dark shoulder against the rail. Then ledger. He didn't need to say more. The book lay open on the marble table, with the pen resting at a precise diagonal that felt like a hand placed on a forearm. Easy now. I looked without letting my eyes rest anywhere too long. My name occupied 3 lines already, the third one darker than ink has any business being. Below it, the page had swollen very slightly, as though something beneath the paper were inhaling. A 4th space waited. The first letter of my name ghosted there like frost on glass. I didn't touch the pen. North doors when you go, the guard said in his usual tone, and then almost gently, If it calls you by a name you like better than your own, pretend you didn't hear. It felt like a benediction disguised as bureaucracy. I pressed the elevator button. The car came without coyness. On the ride up, my reflection in the brushed metal watched me not watch it, and we were both satisfied with the manners of the arrangement. The corridor on 3 smelled like warm paper and the inside of a coat you trust. The archive door sighed me in. Boxes, 6 neat spines of work, the scanner quiet, glass cool as a truth. The clock on the wall held its second hand like a baton, insisting each beat be counted and none be dramatized. The radio clicked once, a courteous throat clear for the hour to come, and slept again. I began. Sometimes work is the rope you throw yourself. Forms from 4647, a hailstorm's tally, a recovered safe, a basement flood that read like a confession. Flatten, feed, smooth, scan, name, save. 10 minutes in, my body remembered the order and took it from my worried mind. At 10, I pressed the radio. 3rd floor, working. 6 boxes remaining. Mezzanine, came steady, heard. Drink water, keep your count. I obeyed. The pipes tasted like they had learned civility from storms. At 10:22, the west stair gave a single small creak, as if clearing its throat to make sure I was still listening. I didn't move. At 10:37, the elevator chimed and opened in the hall. The car's light fell a little too far into the corridor. I didn't look. It waited, then closed, disappointed in a way I could feel in my teeth. At 11 check-in, 4 boxes left. Heard, the mezzanine said, and then quieter. If the glass asks, don't answer. If it writes, read with your eyes closed. I didn't ask him how. Moments later, the window found frost, where there should have been only black. Letters drew themselves faintly in the dim. Keep count. The words unwrote themselves at once, shy to be caught behaving. I turned my chair so the window became a wall, and the wall became everything that mattered. Paper, light. My own breath counted to 10, and then again. At 11:18, the scanner flashed an image not from any claim. The ledger downstairs, open, my name written a 4th time, and beneath it a single line that did not belong to signatures at all. House kept. I blinked it away, scanned again, received the ordinary gray rectangular solace of typewritten damage. I saved the file under its assigned name and didn't try to rename it. At 11:43, footsteps, not the measured kind, but a single pair learning how to be careful. They stopped outside the grill. A voice like paper held to the mouth said my name exactly the way my grandmother would when she found me awake at a forbidden hour. My throat warmed with the memory. I pressed my tongue to the roof of my mouth and counted breaths. When I reached 100, the voice became the hall again, and the hall became quiet. At 12, 3rd floor, I said. 3 boxes left. Heard, the mezzanine replied. A pause. It'll make you an offer after 2. Offers are not questions. Keep your rule. I wanted to ask what my rule was, and then remembered I'd been practicing it all week. Answer only at the hour, count your own house, ask it back. I worked. The building was listening. I could feel it in the way the duck's hum shifted, a not quite melody changing its key to lean closer. At 12:27, the west stair began its repetition, landing and landing, like a needle stuck in one groove of a record that refuses to be a song. It went on long enough to force me into choosing. I chose to stand, place both feet flat, and say softly into the room that did not require my voice, "We are not walking." The stair, as if embarrassed, stopped. At 12:40, the scanner produced a photograph of the lobby in the 1930s, marble brighter, palms and brass planters. A man with a newspaper under his arm paused halfway to the south doors. On the table, the ledger stood thinner, younger, its paper less thirsty. In the mezzanine, a guard leaned just as mine leans, his blazer a century's cousin. I let the image pass through me, the way you let a story do its work. Scan, save. A name for the file arrived uninvited. When you leave, turn left. I kept the assigned numeric. The building could keep its prose. At one juror, third floor, 2 boxes. Heard, the mezzanine said, a breath later adding, reflections are none of our business. The glass of the scanner hummed in agreement, as if flattered to be excluded. At 111, the red notebook waited in the wrong folder again. I opened it because pretending I wouldn't would have been another kind of invitation. A single line, neat and tired. At 1:30, go to the lobby. Look at the ledger. Ask it back. Sign nothing that speaks first. My hand itched. The rule I'd learned in the coastal town, ask it back, rose like a life jacket in water. I pressed the radio. Third floor, going to lobby at 1:30. Silence stretched. Then the guard, go. Do not touch the pen unless the book asks you a question and waits. If it tells you anything, nod and come back. The elevator carried me a little slower, as if savoring me. The lobby had been polished by night. The ledger lay open like a chest cavity, learning how to breathe again, lines and lines of names. The air above the paper had a weight. When I stepped within arm's length, the ink in my 3 signatures deepened, as though made wet again by attention. A 4th space waited, ghost letter faint. I felt it lean. The rules I'd written on the inside of my throat put my voice in order. What do you owe us? The pages did not riffle. The building did not groan. The air grew dense with the feeling of someone halfway through deciding. A faint smell like old receipts warmed beside the book. The pen rolled a fraction, then stilled, pointed toward the line beneath my name. My mouth began to shape the first letter, and my own rule knocked my teeth together. Ask it back. What do you keep when we do not answer? The pen rolled back as if someone had put a finger on it. The half letter on the page unghosted itself, and then thinned again, indecisive. A word formed faintly in the gutter of the ledger, not in ink, but in dented paper, as if written with a dry nib. Return. I thought of the cup at 3:15, the way steam had shaped and gone. I thought of the careful ring on the glaze, the crack deepening. I thought of the way the guard had said, bring a receipt, even if it burns twice. I set my right hand on the edge of the table, palms clean, and nodded to the book with the respect due a living thing. Then I stepped back and returned to the elevator without putting any mark to paper. The car's floor rose under me like a breath. Back on 3, the archive glowed with the same patient light. My chair had kept my shape. At 1:55, the radio spoke my name in the voice of a person I trusted from a decade ago. I counted breaths, steady, 212. It sighed and withdrew. At 212, it sighed and withdrew. At 2 sarin 4, 1 box. Heard, the mezzanine replied, voice thin with endurance. It's going to tell you the terms. Let them pass through. Keep your house. The terms arrived in the way old instruments announce themselves, a hum in the duct that turned into vowels before it turned into words. The room cooled just enough to make my forearms sing. It said no. It urged without calendar or clock. We keep the names that you write and the hours you let us. We give you passage, and we give you quiet, and we give you a place to set your work down. Tell us yes with your hand, and your time will live here. Tell us no with your silence, and we will return your time to you in small coins. You will lose between couch cushions. I felt the pen downstairs without touching it. I felt the ledger's page poised like a breath. The radio stayed wisely asleep. The clock gave me its count. I thought of the guard guarding a different kind of mathematics. I thought of the coastal bell asking, what will you give me? And the only answer that had worked, what do you give me? I bent over the last pages and did the plainest work of the week. Flatten, feed, scan, save. The scanner took the final sheet with a small gratitude. Done. The cartwheels did not squeak when I pushed it. The padlock clicked shut as if enjoying the sound of closure. The elevator waited and did not try to be clever. At 5, the radio woke precisely to say nothing at all, a static the shape of a nod. At 5:12, footsteps in the hall kept perfect pace with my cart and stopped when I stopped. I didn't test it. At 5:20, the west stair rested, finally bored with itself. At 5:30, my reflection in the window remembered to be only mine. At 5:39, I stood in the lobby again with the ledger in its posture of appetite. The pen lay exactly where I had left it, which is to say, exactly where it had wanted to be. The half letter beneath my name was paler still, like a bruise resolving. I breathed, counted 5 of the slowest breaths I owned, and let the book hear my rule again without words. You owe me my house. The paper made no sound. The air softened as if starch had been rinsed from it. On the mezzanine, the guard's pencil stopped moving and then moved again, just enough to tell me he had witnessed what didn't happen. I took the pen, not to the page the ledger wanted, but to the margin outside the ruled lines, and drew a small circle with a line through it, a private sign that meant not now, not like this, closed for night. The nib scratched lightly. The mark looked foolish and precisely right. I set the pen down. The book accepted my impertinence, the way an ocean accepts a pebble, entirely and without conceding anything. North doors, the guard reminded, voice normal again, human-sized. I looked up at him. He looked back, a man at a rail in an old building, tired and careful and alive. 5 nights, he said. That's belonging. You kept your house. Does it forgive me? I asked, not sure whether I meant the building or the book or the part of me that had wanted to sign. He considered that as if it were a good crossword clue. It remembers you, he said. It lets you go through the mornings. That's what forgiveness is in places like this. The north doors opened into a thin dawn that had polished its light on the river. I stepped out with the rules in my pockets, like receipts that would not burn. Buses yawned. A woman walking a dog nodded as if she knew where I'd been. The city's louder clocks started their day. I let them be theirs. At home, I set water to boil, and without thinking, reached for 2 mugs. I poured into one and left the other empty, then laughed at myself and filled them both. When I slept, I dreamed not of ledgers or stairs or glass, but of pages lying flat under a palm, of a pen rolling toward a hand and stopping, of a radio making the sound a person makes when they're about to say your name and decide to let you keep it. The next week, I returned to Whittemore and Glass because contracts end when they end, and doors remember you politely for a while. The elevator blinked agreement. The mezzanine guard wore his blazer like weather. The ledger wanted me where it wanted me, and I replied by placing my hand on the marble an inch away, the way you greet a dog that isn't yours. The book seemed satisfied with the courtesy. I worked. I kept the hour. When the building asked me again in its various voices to move my house into its pages, I asked it back and then asked it smaller questions. How many boxes tonight? How many steps on the stair? How many breaths until the hour says we're allowed to speak? Places like to be counted. Counting makes shapes. Shapes keep you. On my last shift before the contract finished, I slipped the red notebook into the proper folder because it had learned to leave itself in the wrong places when it wanted company. There was one new line in the neat, tired hand. If you leave before 5 nights, bring a receipt. If you leave after, bring a rule. I wrote beneath it, small as a seamstress's mark. I keep my house. Ask me back. I closed the cover, washed a cup that had not been used, dried it, left no proof of wet. The ledger downstairs lay open as always. I nodded to it, as you nod to an instrument that is played well and cleanly. The guard lifted his pencil and set it down and said nothing because nothing needed saying. The north doors gave me the day, and the day took me, and the building behind me ticked in its bones, a metronome that would continue with or without my attention. In the weeks that followed, when the city grew loud, and I felt myself thinning to the shape of a person only bus windows recognize. I took out the habit I had brought home from Whitmore and Glass and counted the kettle's small argument, the elevator in my apartment deciding, the neighbor's careful key, the click my door makes when it forgives me for leaving again. If a pane of night glass ever thought to write me a word, I let it keep its vocabulary. If a stare repeated itself in the corner of my mind, I did not correct it. If a ledger waited in my sleep with a pen tilted at a persuasive angle, I placed my palm on the table beside it and asked it back, "What do you owe me?" And when morning came, as it does, as it did, I left by the north doors of whatever room I was in, belonging to myself and to the small rules that buy the kind of quiet a person can actually rest inside. Thank you for listening. If this story kept you company tonight, consider liking the video and subscribing for more myths, legends, and gentle hauntings. Sleep well, and may the trails you choose lead you safely home.